Hey, welcome back, friend. If you're watching this right now, maybe you're already tucked in, lights are low, the world outside is finally quiet. Then I want you to know you picked the perfect night for this one, because tonight we are not going to ancient Rome. We are not going to royal courts or grand cathedrals or famous battles that fill every history textbook you ever read. Tonight we're going somewhere much stranger, much more forgotten, and honestly much more alive. We're going to the edge. The blurry, messy, lawless, beautiful, terrifying edge of medieval Europe, where civilization ended and something else entirely began. And here's what I want you to ask yourself just for a moment before we dive in. What if the most interesting people in all of the Middle Ages were not the kings, not the knights, not the popes, or the philosophers, or the great warriors? What if the most interesting people were the ones who lived in between in the places that did not fully belong to any kingdom, any faith, any people? What if the real story of medieval Europe was not written in palaces? What if it was written in the dust and smoke of the Borderlands? Now, before we walk into that world together, if this is your first time here, or even if you have been with me for a while, it would genuinely mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. Not because YouTube told me to ask you, but because it is the kindest little thing you can do for someone who spends their nights researching stories like this one, so you can drift off to something beautiful. And hey, leave a comment too. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed on the couch? Is it raining outside? I genuinely love reading those. Now go ahead and dim those lights a little more. Maybe turn on a soft fan if you have one. Let your shoulders drop because tonight's journey starts right now. So let us talk about maps. Medieval maps are fascinating things not because they are accurate, but because they are honest about what people feared. If you look at a medieval map from around the 11th or 12th century, you will notice something strange at the edges. The further you get from the center from the familiar kingdoms, the known roads, the named cities, the more the map starts to unravel. Rivers get wider and more serpentine. Forests become enormous and dark. And then at some point the crafter just gives up. The land fades into vague, scribbled shapes. Sometimes there are notes that say things like "here be dragons," or "unknown territory beyond this point." And for a long time, historians looked at those edges and thought, well, that is just where knowledge ran out. That is where civilization stopped. But here's the thing they missed. People live there. Real people with real lives, real families, real ambitions and fears. And Tuesday mornings, they were not on the map, but they were very much on the land. These were the Borderlands, and they were unlike anywhere else in the medieval world. Now, I want to stop for just a second because I think we need to clear up a common misunderstanding. When most people hear the word Borderlands, they picture something very specific. They picture a clear line in the ground, a wall maybe, or a river with one culture on one side and another culture on the other. Clean, defined, simple. But medieval Borderlands were nothing like that. They were not lines. They were zones. Historian Robert Bartlett, who spent decades studying the expansion of medieval Europe, described them as places where frontier conditions created a society different from both the homeland and the conquered territory. Think about that for a moment. Not one thing, not the other. Something entirely new. These zones could stretch for dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles. And within them, the normal rules of medieval society, who you owed loyalty to, which laws governed you, which faith you practiced, even what language you spoke, all of that became wonderfully, dangerously negotiable. The borderlands of medieval Europe appeared in many places in many forms. There was the Welsh Marches, that long stretch of territory between England and Wales, where Norman lords built their castles not because a king told them to, but because no one told them not to. It was for about 3 centuries one of the most legally bizarre places on earth. The Marcher Lords, as they were called, operated almost entirely outside the law of either England or Wales. They had their own courts, their own customs, their own definition of justice. One historian described it simply as a land where a man could reinvent himself. There was the Reconquista frontier in what is now Spain and Portugal, that ever-shifting no-man's land between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim territories in the south. For almost 800 years from the early 8th century to the late 15th, this frontier moved and breathed and changed shape like something alive. Towns switched hands. Castles were built and rebuilt. And somehow in between the fighting, people traded. People married. People cooked each other's food and borrowed each other's words, and built something that neither side fully intended. There was the Baltic frontier, the long, cold, brutal edge of Christian Europe, pushing into the pagan territories of what is now Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland. The Teutonic Knights carved out a military state there that was, depending on your perspective, either a holy mission or the most sophisticated protection racket in medieval history. Probably both. And there was the Byzantine frontier, those shifting, trembling edges of what remained of the old Roman Empire in the east, where Greek-speaking Christians rubbed up against Slavs, Bulgars, Seljuk Turks, and a dozen other peoples in an endless, exhausting, fascinating negotiation of power and culture. Each of these was different. Each had its own character, its own flavor, its own cast of extraordinary people, but they all shared something. They all shared that quality of being between. And here's why that matters. In the medieval world, identity was everything. You were a serf or lord. You were Christian or Muslim or Jew. You were English or Welsh or French. These are not just labels. They were the architecture of your entire life. They determined who you could marry, what work you could do, whether you could own land, whether you had rights at all. But in the Borderlands, those walls got porous. In the Borderlands, a man who had been abandoned in England could cross into Wales and become a soldier for hire. A Muslim trader who had been excluded from the skip places of Castile could set up his stall just a few miles south and do a thriving business with the very same people who had refused him the day before. A Jewish physician persecuted in one kingdom could find himself the most respected man in the next town over simply because he knew how to treat a fever. The Borderlands, in a strange and beautiful way, were one of the only places in medieval Europe where your past did not have to define your future. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This sounds a little too romantic, a little too idealized, and you're right to push back on that. The Borderlands were also deeply, genuinely dangerous places to live. Violence was not an exception in the Borderlands. It was a structure, a way of organizing relationships, enforcing agreements, settling debts. We will talk much more about that in a later part of this journey, because honestly, the system of Borderland violence deserves its own story. It is stranger and more fascinating than you might expect. But for tonight, I just want you to hold both things at once. The Borderlands were places of extraordinary possibility and extraordinary danger. They were free and frightening, creative and cruel. That tension is the whole point. That tension is what made them unlike anything else in the medieval world. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move on. There's a phrase that historians use when they talk about Borderlands in any era, not just the medieval one. They call it the frontier effect. The idea is simple. When people are removed from the center of power, when the rules become unclear and the authorities are far away, something unexpected tends to happen. Innovation. Not always, not automatically, but with striking frequency. The people who lived at the edge, the people who had to improvise, to negotiate, to blend, to survive, those people produced ideas and customs and technologies and ways of living that the settled, comfortable center never could have generated on its own. The Borderlands of medieval Europe were in this sense not the outskirts of civilization. They were the laboratory of civilization. And in the next part of our journey, we're going to meet the people who actually lived and breathed and loved inside that laboratory. Not the lords and the knights, but the traders, the outcasts, the converts, the wanderers, the ones history almost forgot entirely. They are worth remembering. So get comfortable because we're just getting started. You know, there's something I've been thinking about ever since I first started digging into this topic. We spend so much time in history class talking about the people who held power, the kings who signed treaties, the generals who won battles, the priests who shaped doctrine. And do not get me wrong, those stories matter. But there's another kind of history, a quieter kind. The history of the people who simply showed up every single morning to live their lives in the most complicated circumstances imaginable. And nowhere in medieval Europe were those lives more complicated or more quietly extraordinary than in the Borderlands. So who exactly were these people? Let me paint you a picture. Imagine it's the year 1142. You're standing in a small market town somewhere in the region. The Normans called the Welsh Marches. It is early morning. The air smells like with smoke and damp earth, and something frying in animal fat that you cannot quite identify, but your stomach has already decided it wants. Around you, you can hear at least 3 different languages being spoken simultaneously. A Norman lord is arguing in French with his steward about a disputed field. 2 Welsh farmers are haggling over a price in their own tongue, a language so old it traces back to the ancient Britons before the Romans ever arrived. And threading between them, almost invisible, is a Jewish money changer who has just arrived from Bristol, switching fluently between Latin, French, and a smattering of Welsh, depending on who he is talking to, because that is simply what survival required. Now, here's my question for you. What would you call any of these people English, Welsh, Norman? None of those labels quite fit. They are all in some sense creatures of the edge. People who have learned out of sheer necessity to be more than one thing at once. That is who lived in the Borderlands. Historians have wrestled with how to categorize the population of medieval frontier zones for a long time. And honestly, the more you dig into it, the more the categories fall apart. There were the original inhabitants, the people who had been there before any frontier existed. In Wales, these were Celtic Britons whose culture stretched back further than anyone could reliably document. In the Iberian Peninsula, there were communities that had been living under Moorish rule for generations and had no particular desire to be liberated by anyone. In the Baltic, there were pagan Prussian and Lithuanian communities with sophisticated social structures that the crusading knights who arrived in the 13th century chose to simply ignore, because acknowledging them would have made conquest considerably more awkward. Then there were the settlers, people who had been deliberately encouraged to move into borderland zones by rulers who understood something very important. Empty land is useless land. A frontier without people is just a line on a map that nobody respects. The settlement of the Spanish frontier between the 10th and 13th centuries is one of the most remarkable demographic stories in medieval history. The kings of Leon, Castile, and Aragon essentially ran what we might today call an open immigration policy for anyone willing to move south into contested territory. Peasants from the crowded north towns, people looking for a fresh start, younger sons of minor nobles with nothing to inherit. They all poured southward, and in exchange for simply being there, they received privileges that would have been unimaginable back home. In many frontier towns, serfs became free men the moment they crossed the city boundary and stayed for a year and a day. Think about that. 1 year, 1 day, and your entire legal status changed. There's a beautiful Spanish word for these frontier towns. They were called puras in the early period, meaning roughly occupations or seizures, because the legal theory was that you gained title to the land simply by being the first one to show up and work it. Which, if you think about it, is either a remarkably democratic idea or a remarkably convenient justification for displacement, depending entirely on whose perspective you take. The Borderlands were full of moments like that, full of things that look like freedom from one angle and look like something else entirely from another. Now, among all the different groups who populated these frontier zones, there's one I want to spend a little time on because they're almost always left out of the popular history of the Middle Ages. The converts, people who had changed their religion voluntarily or under pressure or somewhere in the murky middle ground between the two. In the Iberian Peninsula by the late 13th century, there were enormous communities of people known as mud jars. These were Muslims who had chosen or been allowed to remain in territories that had been conquered by Christian kingdoms. They kept their mosques. They kept their legal customs. They kept their language. And they worked as architects and craftsmen and farmers and traders right alongside their Christian neighbors. Walk into the old Cathedral of Seville today and look up at the tower. That tower was built by Mudja craftsmen in the 13th century. The geometric tile work, the arched windows, the minuet-style design, all of it is Islamic architecture in the service of a Christian king. And nobody thought that was particularly strange at the time, because in the Borderlands, you used the skills that were available, not the skills that match your theology. On the other side of the equation, there were the Mozarabs Christians who had lived under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus for so long that they had absorbed enormous amounts of Arabic culture. They spoke Arabic at home. They used Arabic names. Their liturgical manuscripts were illuminated in an artistic style that mixed Christian iconography with Islamic geometric patterns in ways that would have baffled any theologian from the settled heartlands of Europe. When these communities moved northward into the reconquering Christian kingdoms, they brought all of that with them, and it did not always go smoothly. There are records of church councils in the 11th century where northern clergy looked at the liturgical practices of the Mozarabs and said politely but clearly, "What exactly is this?" The Mozarabs, for their part, probably looked back and thought something rather similar. This brings me to something that I think is genuinely underappreciated about medieval borderland society. It was exhausting. I do not mean physically, though. It was certainly that too. I mean the kind of exhaustion that comes from perpetual code switching, from never being fully at home anywhere, from waking up every morning and having to negotiate your identity before you even had breakfast. There is a historian named Richard Fletcher, and if you ever want to go deeper on the medieval Iberian world, his book on the Moors and Christians of Spain is extraordinary, who wrote about the psychological toll of frontier life in a way that I found genuinely moving. He described how the people of the Spanish borderlands developed what he called a kind of frontier mentality, a combination of pragmatism and fatalism that was entirely their own. They did not expect the world to be fair. They did not expect it to be stable. They planned for disruption the way people in stable societies plan for stability. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Because honestly, when I read that, I did not think it sounded medieval at all. Let us talk about a specific person for a moment, because I think individuals always bring history alive in a way that categories never quite can. His name was Petrus Alonzi. Born in the year 1062 in the town of Huesca, in the borderland territory of Aragon. Born Jewish with the name Moses Sephardi. He grew up speaking Arabic Hebrew and the Romance dialect of his region. He studied medicine, astronomy, and the classical Arabic literary tradition. And then in the year 1106, at the age of 44, he converted to Christianity. He took the name Petrus Peter and added Alonzi in honor of his baptismal sponsor, King Alonso I of Aragon. Now, here's where it gets interesting. After his conversion, Petrus Alonzi wrote a book called The Discipliner Clerical Caralesh, which translates roughly as the Scholar's Guide. It was a collection of moral tales and wisdom stories, and it drew freely from Arabic literary traditions, Jewish folk tales, and classical Roman philosophy, all woven together into something that was entirely unmistakably his own. That book was copied and recopied across Europe for the next 3 centuries. Stories from it eventually found their way into Geoffrey Chaucer, into Giovanni Boccaccio, into the foundational texts of European literary culture. A Jewish-born, Arabic-educated Christian, converted physician from the Spanish borderlands, quietly helped shape the trajectory of European literature. You will not find him in most textbooks, but he was real, and he was remarkable, and he was in every possible sense a creature of the borderlands. I want to sit with that for just a second, because I think it says something important. The borderlands did not just produce unusual social arrangements. They produced unusual people. People who had been forced by circumstance to hold multiple ways of understanding the world at the same time. People who had learned because they had to that. Truth is rarely as simple as the side you happen to be standing on. And those people again and again throughout medieval history turned out to be the innovators, the translators not just of languages, but of ideas. The ones who could take a concept from one culture and render it comprehensible to another, and in doing so create something that neither culture had possessed before. There's an argument to be made, and I genuinely believe it, that the intellectual flowering of 12th century Europe, what historians sometimes call the 12th century Renaissance, was powered in very significant part by people like Petrus Alonzi, by the borderland communities who had preserved and translated and synthesized the learning of the Arabic world and made it accessible to the Latin reading scholars of the North. The Great Translation movement, centered largely in Toledo in the 12th and 13th centuries, brought Aristotle back to Europe not from Greece, but from Arabic, not because of European initiative alone, but because of borderland scholars who happen to know both worlds. Think about what that means. The philosophical foundation of medieval European universities, the intellectual framework that shaped everything from Thomas Aquinas to the beginnings of modern science, came through the borderlands, through the people who were not quite anything, who were in between. Now, I promised you at the start that the borderlands were both extraordinary and genuinely hard to live in. And I want to honor that balance, because history that only shows you the beautiful parts is not really history. It is tourism. The people who live in these zones did not choose complexity. because it was romantic. They lived with complexity because they had no other option. A mud-jar craftsman in 13th century Toledo might build the most beautiful mosque in the city on Monday and be subject to a new law restricting his movements on Tuesday. A convert in the Welsh marches might be respected by his Norman neighbors one decade and viewed with deep suspicion the next whenever political wind shifted. A Jewish merchant who had thrived in a border market town for 20 years might find himself expelled from the entire region by a royal decree issued hundreds of miles away by a king who had never set foot in his town and had no idea he existed. The freedom of the Borderlands was real, but it was fragile. It depended on a kind of ongoing collective agreement to look the other way, and that agreement could be revoked at any time, which is maybe the deepest thing the Borderland people understood and which we could stand to remember. Freedom that depends on someone else's tolerance is not quite the same as freedom. It is a beginning. It is something. It is in many cases better than nothing, but it is not the same thing. The Borderland people lived in the space between those two realities, between the remarkable openness of what their world allowed and the precariousness of how easily it could close. And they made something extraordinary in that space, not despite the difficulty, because of it. There is one more thread I want to pull on before we move forward, and it is one that I think will surprise you. We have been talking about people as the defining feature of the Borderlands, and that is right, people are always the defining feature of any place. But the Borderlands were also defined by something else, something physical, something that shaped every aspect of life in these zones, from economics to culture to daily survival, the buildings, specifically the castles. And here's the thing about medieval Borderland castles that almost nobody talks about. They were not primarily built for defense. I know that sounds wrong. It sounds like one of those contrarian historical takes design to make you feel like everything you learned in school was a lie. But stay with me, because the evidence is genuinely fascinating, and that is exactly where we are headed next. Alright, so, at the end of our last section, I made you a promise. I told you that the castles of the medieval Borderlands were not primarily built for defense. And I imagine at least some of you thought, okay, that is a bold claim. Castles are literally the most defensive-looking structures human beings have ever built. They have walls 30 feet thick. They have moats. They have arrow slits and murder holes and portcullises and all manner of architectural features whose entire purpose appears to be the enthusiastic discouragement of anyone trying to get inside uninvited. How exactly is that not about defense? Fair question. And the answer requires us to think about something that medieval lords understood intuitively, but that modern people have largely forgotten. Power is not the same thing as force. Force is what you use when power has already failed. And the most sophisticated Borderland lords, the ones who actually managed to hold their territories across generations rather than just winning and losing them in a cycle of exhausting violence. Those lords understood that a castle was first and foremost a statement. And statements are not about defense. They are about communication. Let me take you somewhere specific, because I think the abstract argument becomes much more vivid when you're standing in front of the actual evidence. The year is 1177. You are traveling along a river valley in the Welsh marches that contested a borderland between England and Wales that we have been spending so much time in. And ahead of you on a rocky promontory above a river bend, you see something that was not there 20 years ago. A castle. Not just any castle. A castle built to a very specific and relatively new design. A rectangular stone keep on an earthen mound surrounded by a walled courtyard with the whole complex sitting at exactly the point where the river valley narrows. And anyone moving through this territory must pass within sight of it. You cannot go around it. Not practically. The terrain does not allow it. And here's what I want you to notice, because it is the key to the whole argument. That castle does not have enough soldiers in it to stop a serious military force. If a large army comes through this valley, the castle garrison will not ride out and defeat them in the field. They will shut the gate and wait, which is fine as a survival strategy, but does nothing to actually control the valley. What the castle does is something more subtle. It watches. It sees everyone who passes. It records the movement of goods and people. It collects tolls from the merchants using the road. It demonstrates to every farmer and trader and traveler in the surrounding area that someone with money and power has claimed this space. That this is not the ungoverned edge anymore. That the ambiguity, the delicious borderland ambiguity that allowed the people here to exist in the cracks between kingdoms. That ambiguity is now officially someone's project to eliminate. The castle is not a shield. It is a flag. The historian R. Alan Brown, who spent his career studying medieval military architecture, made an observation that I think cuts straight to the heart of this. He wrote that the primary function of the medieval castle was not military in the defensive sense, but rather what he called the expression and enforcement of lordship. Lordship, not defense. The castle enforced who had the right to be where to do what, and to keep how much of the resulting profit. And in the Borderlands, where those questions were perpetually contested, where the definitions of who belonged to which kingdom and owed loyalty to which lord were always in flux, a castle was essentially a physical argument. A stone and mortar claim being made in a landscape where many competing claims were already in play. The Marcher Lords of Wales understood this with particular clarity. When William the Conqueror gave his most powerful barons the right to conquer and hold Welsh territory by their own means, he created something that had not quite existed before in English legal history. He created a class of lords whose authority derived not from royal grant, but from personal conquest. You held what you could take, and you kept it by demonstrating continuously that you were capable of taking more. The castles they built were the physical embodiment of that demonstration. Look at Chepstow Castle, which sits on a cliff above the River Wye in what is now the border between England and Wales. It was begun by William Fitz-Osber in 1067, one of the earliest stone castles in Britain, built within a year of the Norman conquest itself. It was not built because there was an imminent Welsh military threat that required a defensive structure. It was built because Fitz-Osber needed everyone in the Wye Valley to look up from whatever they were doing and understand without any further explanation. Required that the calculus of power in this landscape had permanently changed. The cliff did that. The stone walls did that. The sheer visible ambition of the structure did that, and it worked for centuries. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting from a Borderland perspective, because the story does not end with intimidation. The Norman lords who built the great Marcher castles were not stupid. They were in fact some of the most politically sophisticated operators of their era, and they understood something that pure military logic misses entirely. You cannot run a territory on force alone. Force is expensive. It requires soldiers who require pay, who require revenue, who require a functioning local economy, which requires the cooperation of the very people you are theoretically imposing your authority upon. The math only works if you make your presence profitable for enough of the local population that they have a reason to prefer your castle being there to the alternative. And so almost immediately the Borderland castles became something else alongside their role as instruments of power. They became centers of economic activity. Markets grew up outside castle walls because the castle guaranteed a certain minimum of physical security that made commercial activity possible. Craftsmen settled near castles because the garrison needed equipment and food and services. Lawyers and administrators came because there were disputes to resolve and rents to collect. Clergy arrived because the lord needed spiritual legitimacy and the population needed churches. The castle attracted a town, and the town became the real engine of Borderland power. There is a perfect example of this process in action along the Spanish Reconquista frontier, and it involves a castle that most people have never heard of, but which played a crucial role in the economic development of the entire region. The castle of Calatrava sits on a low hill above the Guadiana River in what is now the Spanish region of Castilla-La Mancha. It was originally a Moorish fortress controlling a strategic river crossing. The military orders, specifically the Knights of Calatrava, after whom the castle was named, took it over in the mid-12th century as the Christian frontier pushed south. Now, the military situation in this region in the 12th century was genuinely dangerous. The frontier was active. Raids went back and forth across the river with some regularity. There was a real military dimension to the castle's function. But here's what the records show about what the castle actually spent most of its time doing: collecting tolls from merchants crossing the river in both directions. The castle sat astride one of the most important commercial arteries connecting the Christian north and the Muslim south of the Iberian Peninsula. And rather than closing that artery, rather than turning the castle into an instrument of commercial restriction, the Knights of Calatrava ran it as an instrument of commercial facilitation. You want to cross, you can cross, you pay the toll. The toll finances the garrison. The garrison maintains the road and the bridge and the security that makes the crossing possible. The crossing generates commerce. The commerce generates prosperity on both sides. Round and round. The castle was a piece of economic infrastructure dressed up in military architecture. And the genius of it, the thing that I think medieval borderland lords understood in their bones, even when they could not have articulated it in these terms, is that a commercially active castle was far harder to dislodge than a purely military one. Because a purely military castle has enemies, a commercially active castle has clients. Have you ever driven through a small American town built around an old railroad junction where the town exists specifically? Because the railroad needed a stopping point, and everything grew up around that function. And now the railroad is gone, but the town is still there because the economic activity it generated took on a life of its own. The Borderland Castle Town was the medieval version of that dynamic. The castle created the conditions. The market did the rest. And this is why when you look at the actual locations of the great Borderland castle complexes in Wales, in Spain, in the Baltic, in the Crusader Levant, you find something that a purely military analysis cannot explain. They are almost always at river crossings, at mountain passes, at the intersection of trade routes, at the places where goods and people naturally concentrated regardless of political arrangements. Not on the highest defensible ground, not at the points of maximum military advantage, at the points of maximum commercial traffic. Because that was where the was and money in the medieval borderlands was power in a way that soldiers alone could never quite replicate. The Crusader Castle of Crackdish in what is now Syria is perhaps the most famous medieval castle in the world. It has been called by various admiring commentators over the centuries the greatest castle ever built. Tay Lawrence, who visited it in the early 20th century and knew something about the strategic value of fortifications, described it as perhaps the best preserved and most admirable castle in the world. It is genuinely extraordinary as a piece of military architecture. The walls, the towers, the inner and outer wards, the water management system, all of it represents the absolute pinnacle of medieval defensive design. But what made Crack Shiver genuinely important in the 12th and 13th centuries was not its walls. It was its location. The castle sits in a mountain past the Homs Gap that is the principal route connecting the Mediterranean coast to the Syrian interior. Every caravan moving between the coastal cities and the inland markets passed through this gap. Every merchant, every diplomat, every pilgrim, every army moving between the sea and the interior had to go through or near Crackdy Salier. The Hospitallers who held the castle from 1142 onward understood this perfectly. They taxed the traffic. They provided security for merchants willing to pay for it. They made themselves, in the most direct commercial sense, indispensable to the entire regional economy. The walls were spectacular, but the tolls were the point. Now, I want to complicate this picture slightly because I think honest history requires it. The vision of borderland castles as clever economic instruments rather than brutal military impositions is to some degree the view from the castle. The view from the village below the castle was rather different for the local populations. The Welsh farmers in the shadow of a new Norman castle. The Moorish agricultural communities beneath the expanding Castilian frontier fortresses. The pagan Baltic villages near Teutonic Knight strongholds. The castle's primary meaning was not commercial facilitation. It was extraction. The tolls that financed the garrison came from somewhere. The rents that built the town walls came from someone. The economic activity that made the borderland castle system so durable was at its base underwritten by agricultural communities who had not necessarily chosen to be part of the arrangement and who did not always benefit from it in proportion to what they contributed. The borderland castle was a machine for converting local labor and resources into centralized power. And while it often did provide real services, security, legal, arbitration, commercial infrastructure, those services were never entirely separable from the coercive relationship that funded them. This is the contradiction at the heart of the whole Borderlands story. The same structures that enabled the extraordinary creativity and cultural fusion we have been celebrating throughout this journey were also instruments of dispossession and control. The same marcher lords who built legal frameworks sophisticated enough to rival any in the medieval Europe were also capable of arbitrary violence against the populations they governed. The Borderlands were not innocent. Nothing human is, but they were remarkable. And the castles were the most visible, most durable, most immediately legible expression of everything they contained: the power and the commerce, the control and the creativity, the stone certainty of authority, and the endlessly negotiated reality of daily life. In the spaces beneath the walls. There is one more thing about Borderland castles I want to tell you, because it is perhaps the most unexpected turn in the whole story, and it leads us directly to where we need to go next. Some of the most architecturally significant castles in the Borderlands were not built by the conquerors. They were built by the conquered. Or rather, they were built by communities that occupied that ambiguous middle space between conquest and resistance. Communities that had learned through hard experience that the best way to survive in a borderland was not to resist the new power structures, but to make yourself indispensable to them. The Mudja master builders, the Muslim craftsmen, who remained in the Christian-controlled cities of the Yakanista and built for their new lords, constructed some of the most sophisticated defensive and residential architecture in the entire medieval Iberian world. Their technical knowledge of Islamic architectural engineering, their understanding of how to build in local materials, their mastery of water management and structural load distribution, all of it went into buildings that served the political purposes of the Christian kingdoms, while embodying the aesthetic and technical traditions of the culture. Those kingdoms are just defeated. The castle that protected the new order was built by the hands of the old one. That is not irony in the cheap sense. It is something deeper. It is the Borderlands being exactly what they always were. A place where the categories refuse to stay clean, where the conqueror needs the conquered, and the conquered find ways to persist inside the conqueror's project, where the walls that divide two worlds are built from the combined knowledge of both. And all of that brings us to a question that I think has been hovering at the edge of this whole conversation about castles and power, and who controls what. If the castle was the instrument of Borderland economic control, if it was the toll booth and the courthouse and the political statement, and the commercial hub all rolled into one imposing piece of stone architecture, then what happened in the spaces the castle could not quite reach? What happened in the markets that grew up just far enough from the castle walls to operate with a degree of independence? What happened when the merchants who were supposed to be paying the Lord's tolls found ways to do business that the Lord could not easily tax or monitor? What happened, in other words, when the Borderland economy ran faster than the Borderland state could follow? The answer is one of the most fascinating commercial stories in all of medieval history. And it involves enemies who traded with each other every single morning, rain or shine, war or peace, right across the lines that were supposed to keep them apart. That is exactly where we're going next, right? So we have talked about the land. We have talked about the people who chose to live on it. And we have spent some time with the castles, those beautiful, complicated symbols of power that were never quite what they seemed. But here's a question that honestly kept me up one night while I was deep in research for this series. If medieval Borderlands were so dangerous, if they were zones of raid and feud and shifting loyalty and genuine physical risk, then why did people keep showing up to do business there? Why would a merchant from Burgos load up his mules with wool and leather goods and walk south toward a frontier that both sides officially considered enemy territory? Why would a craftsman from Cordoba carry his metal work northward into the kind of uncertain zone where your legal status could change with the weather? Why did they go? The answer, it turns out, is so simple and so human that it almost made me laugh when I finally understood it. They went because that is where the money was. Let me take you somewhere specific. It is the year 1179. You are standing in the market town of Cuenca, which has just been captured by Alonso VII of Castile from its previous Muslim rulers 3 years earlier. The ink on the conquest is barely dry. There are still Castilian soldiers garrisoned in the old Moorish citadel. There are still families in the lower town who have been there for 4 generations and are not entirely sure what to make of their new situation. And yet the market is open. Not just open, it is thriving. There are merchants here who traveled 3 days from Toledo. There are traders who came up from the still Muslim south carrying spices and dyed fabrics, and worked leather goods that you simply cannot find anywhere north of the frontier. There are Jewish brokers standing at the center of it all, facilitating transactions between parties who do not share a language, a religion, or technically a peace treaty. Alonso VII, to his enormous credit, understood something that many rulers of his era did not. You do not build a frontier town by fortifying it. You build it by making it the most profitable place within a week's ride to do business. So he issued Cuenca a furrow, a royal charter of privileges that was so generous, it reads almost like a medieval advertisement. Reduced taxes for merchants, legal protections for traders of all faiths, guaranteed safe conduct through the market zone, regardless of where you came from. Cuenca grew fast. Within a generation, it had become one of the most prosperous wool trading centers in Castile. And the funny thing is a significant portion of that prosperity came from trade with the people who had just lost the city. This was not unique to Cuenca, not even close. The phenomenon of enemies trading with each other across an active military frontier is one of those things that historians sometimes call an embarrassment, not because it is shameful, but because it embarrasses the clean narrative. The narrative that says war means separation, that says cultural conflict means economic rupture. The medieval Borderlands refused that narrative at almost every turn. Take the Anglo-Scottish border in the 13th and 14th centuries. England and Scotland were for much of this period in a state of what you might generously call recurring hostility. The Wars of Scottish Independence, beginning in 1296, produced decades of genuine, devastating military conflict. Entire towns were burned. Populations were displaced. Edward I of England, not a man known for his gentleness, conducted campaigns in Scotland that left scars on the landscape for generations. And yet the border markets kept running. There is a document from 1314, the same year as the Battle of Bannockburn, which was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war, recording a formal trade agreement between merchants from Carlisle on the English side and merchants from Dumfries on the Scottish side. Both towns have been raided within living memory. Both had residents who had lost family members to the other side's armies. They still needed each other's goods. The Scots had wool and cattle and fish. The English had access to continental cloth markets and manufactured goods that Scotland could not easily produce. And so they sat down apparently without any particular sense of irony and worked out a deal. Now, I find myself genuinely moved by that, and I want to try to explain why. Because it would be easy to look at that document and say, well, that just proves that greed trumps everything. That commerce is always stronger than conflict. But I do not think that is quite right. Or rather, I think it is not the most interesting interpretation. What those merchants were doing in 1314 in the shadow of a war that was reshaping the political map of Britain, what they were doing was something quietly radical. They were insisting on a shared humanity that the war was trying to erase. They were saying in the most practical possible language, we are not only our armies, we are also our needs and our skills and our capacity to build something together that neither of us could build alone. Is that sentimental? Maybe a little, but it is also documented, and it kept happening over and over again across 2 centuries of intermittent warfare. The border markets of northern England and southern Scotland refused to fully close. There is a term that medieval historians use for these kinds of arrangements, though not always in a complimentary way. They call them truces of the market. The idea is simple. Whatever is happening politically, whatever armies are doing in the field, the marketplace operates under a temporary suspension of hostility. You come to the market in good faith. You trade honestly. You leave with what you came for. And the understanding, never written down because writing it down would have required acknowledging it officially, which nobody wanted to do, was that this space was for the duration of commerce neutral ground. The most elaborate version of this system existed along the frontier between the Kingdom of Aragon and the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada in the 14th century. Granada was the last remaining Muslim kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula. It was officially at war on and off with the surrounding Christian kingdoms for almost 2½ centuries. And yet the trading relationship between Granada and its Christian neighbors was so dense, so mutually dependent, so economically vital that neither side could afford to let it collapse. Silk came out of Granada. Raw silk produced in the Alpujarras Mountains south of the city, which was so fine and so consistently good that it was considered the best in all of Western Europe. Aragons and Castilian merchants bought it in enormous quantities and resold it across the continent at substantial profit. Granada in turn needed grain. The Nasrid Kingdom's geography made large-scale cereal farming difficult. Without regular grain imports from the Christian north, the city faced serious food security problems. So the two sides officially at war, periodically raiding each other's territory, negotiating ransoms for captives taken in border skirmishes, maintain a structured commercial relationship that both parties understood was keeping each other alive. There were licensed brokers on both sides. There were agreed exchange rates. There were formal complaints procedures when goods were confiscated by soldiers who had not received the memo about the truce. There were memos about truces between kingdoms that were officially at war. Sometimes history is so human it hurts. Let me bring in someone whose story I think captures all of this better than any general description could. His name was Francesco Dattini. He was a merchant from Pau in what is now Tuscany, who built one of the most successful trading businesses of the late 14th century. His archive, and this is remarkable, survived almost completely intact. Over 150,000 letters and documents preserved in PTO that give historians an extraordinary window into how medieval longue distance commerce actually worked. Dattini was not a borderland merchant himself, but his business absolutely depended on the borderland trade networks. He had agents in Valencia who sourced granite silk. He had contacts in Majorca who worked as brokers between Christian and Muslim trading houses. He had representatives in Palmo who navigated the astonishing commercial complexity of medieval Sicily, a place that had been within living memory under Arab, Norman, German, and French rule, and had somehow absorbed all of it into a single remarkably functional trading culture. What the Dini archive reveals is not just the mechanics of medieval commerce. It reveals the relationships. The letters are full of personal detail, worry about a partner's health excitement, about a particularly good deal frustration about a delayed shipment, gratitude for a favor done across a great distance. These were not abstractions. They were people who knew each other, trusted each other, often across religious and cultural lines that the official world insisted were impassable. Dattini had Muslim business contacts he referred to with genuine warmth and respect. He had Jewish agents whose judgment he trusted over that of his Christian partners in certain markets. The commercial world of the Borderlands ran, to a very significant degree, on relationships that the political world would have preferred did not exist. Here's something I want you to really sit with for a moment, because I think it is one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of the whole Borderlands story. Medieval commerce was in many ways more cosmopolitan than medieval politics. Politics in the Middle Ages was obsessed with difference, with hierarchy, with the absolute importance of keeping things in their proper categories. Christians here, Muslims there, Jews in their designated quarter, serfs on their land, lords in their castles. But the marketplace systematically undermined all of that. Not because merchants were especially virtuous or idealistic. They were not. They were by and large people who wanted to make money. But in the process of wanting to make money, they built networks of trust and interdependence that crossed every boundary the political world tried to maintain. They developed shared languages, not just linguistically, but commercially. Standard weights and measures, recognized exchange rates, agreed upon arbitration procedures for disputes. They built, in other words, a kind of parallel civilization, one that ran underneath the official civilization and kept it functioning in ways that the official civilization rarely acknowledged and sometimes actively tried to suppress. The suppression part is worth dwelling on for just a moment, because it is a part of this story that tends to get glossed over. The borderland markets were not universally loved, not even close. The church periodically condemned trade with Muslims and Jews as spiritually dangerous. Various royal decrees attempted to restrict or regulate commercial contact across religious lines. There were genuine recurring political anxieties about the idea that commerce might be building bonds of loyalty that competed with the bonds the political system was trying to impose. And those anxieties were not entirely unfounded. When you have done business with someone for 20 years, when you have trusted them with significant amounts of money, when they have trusted you, when you have eaten at each other's tables and helped each other through bad seasons and celebrated each other's good fortune, the official categories start to feel a little thin. Not always. Not for everyone. Human beings are perfectly capable of maintaining warm personal relationships and still participating in systems of collective discrimination. History is full of examples of that particular combination, and the medieval borderlands were no exception. But the erosion was real, and the authorities could feel it, and it frightened them. There is a wonderful phrase that appears in several church documents from the 12th and 13th centuries warning clergy about the dangers of excessive familiarity with non-Christian neighbors. They called it nimia familiaris, too much closeness, as if closeness itself were the danger, and in a world built entirely on the enforcement of distance between classes, between faiths, between peoples. Maybe it was the borderland markets in the end were about more than wool and silk and grain and cattle. They were about the stubborn human insistence that practical need matters, that shared interest matters, that the person standing across the stall from you speaking a different language and praying to a different God is still at some fundamental level. Someone you can do business with, and sometimes not always, but sometimes someone you can understand. That is a quiet kind of revolution. It does not look like one. It does not announce itself with banners or manifestos. It just shows up at the market every morning, rain or shine, war or peace, carrying what it has to offer and looking for what it needs. And somehow over centuries that quiet, stubbornness changed everything. But here's what I have not told you yet. The markets were the surface of something much deeper, much stranger, much more intimate. Because when people trade long enough, when they sit close enough, long enough across enough shared meals and shared seasons, they start doing something else entirely. They start to speak each other's language, not just figuratively, literally. And what happens to a language when it lives at the edge of two worlds, when it is made of pieces of both, and belongs fully to neither, is one of the most haunting and beautiful stories in all of medieval history. That is exactly where we're going next. Languages are strange, quiet things. They do not announce themselves. They do not hold press conferences or sign treaties. They just happen slowly, almost invisibly, in the spaces between people who need to understand each other and have not quite figured out how yet. And if you want to find the most extraordinary languages that medieval Europe ever produced, the ones that carry the fingerprints of two worlds pressed together, you do not look in the royal courts. You do not look in the monasteries where Aladdin sat in careful preserved stillness like an insect in amber. You look at the edges. You look at the borderlands. Because the borderlands did not just produce hybrid people and hybrid markets and hybrid architecture. They produced hybrid words, hybrid grammars, entire ways of speaking that existed nowhere else on earth, that could only have been born in that particular friction, in that particular place, at that particular moment in history. And some of those languages are gone now completely irrecoverably. And when I tell you what was lost, I think you might feel as I did a very specific kind of grief that is hard to name, but impossible to shake. Let me start with a word you have probably never heard before. Algemiardo. Say it slowly. Alhamdo. There is something almost musical about it, which is appropriate, because the story behind it is one of the most quietly beautiful linguistic stories I have ever encountered. Algiardo was a language, or more precisely a writing system, used by Muslims living in Christian-controlled Spain from roughly the 13th century onward. Here's what made it extraordinary. The people who wrote it were speaking Spanish, the Romance dialect of the Iberian Peninsula, Castilian essentially, or something very close to it, a language descended from Latin, shaped by centuries of Christian culture and political history. But they were writing it in Arabic script, right to left, in the flowing, elegant characters of a language their grandparents or great-grandparents had spoken at home in a world that no longer quite existed. Why? Because Arabic was sacred to them. Arabic was the language of the Quran. And even as they lost their Arabic speech, even as the generations passed, and the children grew up speaking the language of their neighbors and their marketplace and their employers, they held on to the script. They wrote their Spanish prayers in Arabic letters. They copied Spanish love poems in Arabic characters. They kept journals and legal documents and recipes in a visual language that was becoming increasingly disconnected from the spoken one. There is something about that image, a person writing the words of one world in the alphabet of another, that I find almost unbearably moving. It is the written equivalent of someone humming a song their grandmother sang in a language they no longer quite understand, because the melody is the only thing they have left. Now Algemiardo is one end of the spectrum. It is a language that preserved form while the content shifted underneath it. But there were other borderland languages that went in the opposite direction. Languages that took the content, the vocabulary, the concepts, the raw material of expression from multiple sources simultaneously, and built something genuinely new. The most extraordinary example to my mind is Ladino. Ladino, also called Judeo-Spanish or Sedesmo, was the language of the Sephardic Jews, the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula who were expelled from Spain in 1492 by the decree of Ferdinand II and Isabella I. That expulsion is one of the great catastrophes of medieval history, and we will return to it in a later part of this series. But the language those expelled communities carried with them is something I want to focus on right now because it is one of the most remarkable linguistic time capsules in all of human history. The Dino's foundation was medieval Castilian Spanish, the Spanish of the late 15th century, the Spanish spoken in Toledo and Seville and Córdoba in the years before the expulsion. But it was not just Spanish. It was Spanish that had been living for centuries inside Jewish communities that also spoke Hebrew for religious purposes and Arabic for commerce and governance. It was Spanish that had absorbed Hebrew grammatical structures in subtle ways, that had borrowed Arabic vocabulary for certain concepts, that had developed its own idioms and expressions shaped by the specific experience of being Jewish in a world that was never quite sure whether it wanted you or not. And then here is the haunting part. The expulsion happened, and the communities that carried Ladino scattered to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to the Netherlands, to the Americas. And Ladino kept evolving in those new places, absorbing Turkish and Greek and Italian, depending on where the community settled. But at its core, it preserved something extraordinary. It preserved medieval Spanish. Linguists who study Latino today describe it as a living museum of a language that no longer exists anywhere else. Vocabulary that disappeared from standard Spanish 5 centuries ago is still alive in Ladino. Grammatical forms that Fanny would have recognized, but that a modern Spanish speaker finds archaic are still in daily use in Latino-speaking communities. The Borderlands, in a very real sense, did not just shape the people who lived in them. They shaped the words those people carried out into the rest of the world. And some of those words are still echoing right now in communities whose grandparents' were children in a Spain that no longer exists. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it for a moment. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed to explain yourself in a language that did not quite have the words for what you were trying to say? Maybe you were trying to describe a feeling or a concept or a specific kind of relationship, and the language you were speaking just did not have the vocabulary for it. And you found yourself reaching, borrowing, approximating, using words that were almost right, but not quite building something imperfect out of whatever was available. That is more or less what happens when two languages collide over generations in a borderland space. People reach, people approximate, people build something imperfect and practical out of whatever is available. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes what they build turns out to be more expressive, more flexible, more alive than either of the languages that went into it. The Crusader states offer one of the most compressed and dramatic examples of linguistic collision in all of medieval history. When the First Crusade established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the surrounding Crusader principalities in the early 12th century, they created an extraordinary linguistic pressure cooker. You had French-speaking nobles from the heartland of the crusading movement. You had Italian merchants, Genoese, Venetian Pisans, who served as the commercial backbone of the entire enterprise and spoke their own distinct dialects. You had Greek-speaking Christians who had been living in the region for centuries. You had Arabic-speaking local populations, both Christian and Muslim. You had Armenian communities in the north. You had small but significant Jewish populations, and you had the constant flow of pilgrims from every corner of Europe, each bringing their own linguistic fragment to the mix. What emerged from that collision was a contact language that historians sometimes call Crusader French, or Utrema French Utra, meaning simply overseas, which was how the Crusaders described their little experiment in the Levant. Utrema French was French at its core, but it had absorbed enormous amounts of Arabic vocabulary, particularly for things that the French language simply had not needed words for before. Foods, spices, architectural features, local plants and animals, agricultural techniques suited to a very different climate, medical concepts drawn from the rich tradition of Arabic medicine that the Crusaders were simultaneously fighting against and desperately borrowing from. There is a 12th century medical text from the Crusader period that describes treatment for a common skin condition using vocabulary that mixes Old French, Arabic, and Greek in a single sentence. The scribe apparently did not find this remarkable. It was just how you talked about medicine in that place at that time. Here is a detail I love, and I want to share it because it perfectly illustrates how language works in these and between spaces. The Arabic word sukr, meaning sugar, traveled into medieval European languages through the commercial networks of the Borderlands and the Crusader trade routes. In Italian, it became zucchero. In Spanish, it became azúcar with that telltale at the beginning that marks so many Arabic borrowings into Spanish. In French, it became sucre. In English, it became sugar. One Arabic word scattered across an entire continent's worth of languages, each one shaped slightly differently by the particular borderland through which it passed. Italian received it through Sicily and the Venetian trade networks. Spanish received it through the Reconquista frontier. French received it partly through the Crusader states, partly through Norman Sicily. English received it through French. Every time you put sugar in your coffee, you're in a tiny and completely unintentional way participating in a linguistic chain that runs back through the medieval borderlands to the markets of the medieval Arab world, which I find delightful, especially late at night. But I want to come back to something more intimate than etymology, because I think the most profound thing about borderland languages is not the vocabulary. It is the grammar. Vocabulary borrowing is common. Languages borrow words from each other all the time, often without any deep cultural contact. You borrow words for new things. You encounter new foods, new technologies, new concepts. English borrowed tsunami from Japanese without any significant cultural fusion between England and Japan. Grammar is different. When the grammatical structure of one language starts to influence another, when the way you build a sentence, the way you signal time and relationship and emphasis starts to shift toward another language's pattern, that means something much deeper is happening. That means people are not just borrowing words across a counter. They are living inside each other's cognitive frameworks. They are thinking at least partially in each other's ways. And that is exactly what happened in the most deeply integrated borderland communities. In medieval Sicily, under the Norman kings of the 12th century, the island hosted one of the most genuinely multilingual courts in all of medieval history. Roger II and his successors spoke Norman, French, Latin, Greek, and Arabic, not as party tricks, but as functional necessities of governing a population that was split roughly equally between those linguistic communities. The royal court employed Arab poets who wrote in Arabic, Greek administrators who kept records in Greek, Latin scholars who produced the theological and philosophical texts expected of a Christian kingdom, and Norman lords who went home at night and spoke French with their families. The poetry produced at the Norman Sicilian court, and this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary, was written in a dialect that mixed all of these influences together in proportions that varied from poet to poet and poem to poem. The Sicilian school of poetry, which flourished in the 13th century under Frederick II, is widely considered the birthplace of the Italian literary tradition. Dante himself acknowledged it as the foundation of the vernacular literary culture that made his own work possible. The Italian literary tradition, the one that runs from the Sicilian school through Dante and Petrarch and Passio, and eventually to the entire edifice of modern Italian literature, was born in a borderland in a place where Norman French and Arabic and Greek and Latin collided, and out of that collision produced something that had never existed before. Frederick II himself, and this is a man who deserves his own entire series, honestly, was one of the most linguistically extraordinary rulers in medieval history. He spoke 6 languages fluently. He corresponded with Muslim scholars in Arabic. He wrote poetry in the Sicilian vernacular. He conducted philosophical debates in Latin. He managed his multilingual empire in a combination of all of them, depending on context and audience. His contemporaries called him Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. They meant it partly as a compliment and partly as something closer to alarm, because a man who moved that fluidly between languages and cultures was in the deeply categorical medieval world view slightly suspicious. What was he exactly? What did he really believe? What was his true loyalty? The Borderlands produced many people about whom those questions were asked, and most of them, I think, would have answered the same way that Frederick might have answered if he had been in a philosophical rather than a political mood. I am what I am because of where I grew up, because of the languages I was given, because of the worlds that shaped me, and those worlds were more than one. There is one more linguistic story I want to tell you before we move on, because it is perhaps the most poignant of all. In the archives of the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid, there are a series of manuscripts discovered in the late 19th century in a hidden space beneath the floorboards of a house in the Aragonese town of Almanac de la Sierra. The manuscripts date from the 16th century, and they were written in Algemiardo, that Spanish and Arabic script system I described at the beginning. They were hidden because by the time they were written, the community that produced them had been forced to convert to Christianity. They were officially called Moriscoco's former Muslims who had accepted baptism willingly or otherwise under pressure from the Spanish crown. They were supposed to have abandoned their old language, their old prayers, their old ways of understanding the world. But they had not. Beneath the floorboards in secret, they were still writing, still using the alphabet of a world that had been officially erased, still preserving the words and prayers and stories of a community that the state had decided should not exist anymore. Those manuscripts were hidden around 1500. They were found approximately 350 years later. Someone hid them with the intention of coming back. They never came back. Or if they did, they could not retrieve them. Maybe the person who hid them died before they could return. Maybe they were expelled before they got the chance. Maybe the hiding place was just too well chosen. And so the manuscript sat there in the dark under the floor of a house in a small town in Aragon for 3.5 centuries, waiting for someone to remember a language that no longer had any speakers left. That story stays with me. It has stayed with me since the first time I read about it. And I suspect it will stay with me for a long time, because that is what the Borderland languages were at their deepest level. They were attempts to hold on to something, to preserve a way of being in the world that the powerful forces of history kept trying to erase. They were evidence that the people who lived between worlds did not want to give up either world, that they fought not always with weapons, not always visibly, to keep something alive. Some of those languages are still alive today. Ladino is still spoken, though, by fewer and fewer people with each passing generation. Others are gone, completely and irretrievably gone. And with them went not just words but ways of seeing, ways of understanding the relationship between sacred and secular, between self and community, between what you say out loud and what you write down in secret in the dark. A language is never just a language. It is a whole world. And the borderlands of medieval Europe were full of whole worlds that history decided were inconvenient. Which brings us naturally to the most inconvenient world of all. Because if language is where two cultures touch each other lightly, tentatively, commercially, practically, then religion is where they touch each other at the deepest possible level. And what happened to religious faith in the borderlands? What people actually believed, what they actually practiced behind closed doors, away from the eyes of whatever authority happened to be watching, is stranger, more tender, and more complicated than almost anything else in this entire story. That is where we are headed next. There is a shrine in the mountains of southern Italy in a region called Calabria, near the toe of the Italian boot, that has been drawing pilgrims for over 900 years. The shrine is dedicated to the Archangel Michael. Nothing unusual about that. Medieval Italy was full of shrines to saints and angels. Pilgrimage was as natural as breathing in the medieval world. But here's the thing about this particular shrine. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the pilgrims who climbed that mountain to pray at it were not all Christian. Some of them were Muslim. And they came, and not because they were confused or coerced or hedging their spiritual bets out of some kind of medieval Pascal's wager. They came because in their understanding of the sacred, shaped by a lifetime of living alongside Christian neighbors, trading with them, working with them, sometimes marrying into their families. The Archangel Michael was a figure of genuine power and genuine protection. They came because in the borderlands, the boundaries between what was sacred to one faith and what was sacred to another were very often considerably more permeable than any theologian on either side would have been comfortable admitting. This is the part of the Borderlands story that makes people the most uncomfortable. And I understand why. We have spent centuries constructing the history of medieval religious conflict as a story of clean opposites. Christianity against Islam. Islam against Christianity. Both against Judaism. Crusade and jihad. Reconquest and resistance. The great clash of civilizations playing out across the medieval centuries in a kind of slow, grinding, inevitable drama. And that story is not false. The conflicts were real. The suffering was real. People died in enormous numbers because of religious difference, and minimizing that would be dishonest. But, and this is the part that tends to get left out running alongside that story of conflict, sometimes inside it, sometimes underneath it, sometimes so thoroughly woven into it that you cannot separate the two, was a completely different story. A story of what actually happened when people who prayed differently had to live together in the same small town, breathe the same air, draw water from the same well, and figure out how to manage the 10,000 practical details of shared daily life. What happened, it turns out, was complicated, surprising, sometimes deeply moving, and nowhere was it more visible than in the Borderlands. Let me introduce you to a concept that historians of medieval religion use, though not always with full agreement about what it means. They call it convivencia. It is a Spanish word. It means roughly living together, or more precisely coexistence. The practice of different religious communities sharing a social space, not in perfect harmony, but in something more than simple hostility. The concept is associated most strongly with medieval Iberia, with the centuries-long experiment of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities inhabiting the same cities, the same neighborhoods, sometimes the same streets. And it has become in modern scholarship somewhat controversial. Some historians argue that the term romanticizes what was in reality a deeply unequal and often tense relationship. Others argue that dismissing it entirely misses something genuinely important and genuinely unusual about what medieval Iberia produced. I think both sides have a point. The Borderlands did not produce utopia. They produced something messier and more interesting than utopia. They produced a world where a Christian nobleman in 13th century Toledo could hire a Muslim architect, employ a Jewish physician, have his taxes calculated by a Jewish accountant, have his horoscope read by a Muslim astronomer, and attend church on Sunday all in the same week without any of this striking him or anyone around him as particularly remarkable. That is not tolerance in the modern sense. It is not pluralism. The Christian nobleman almost certainly considered himself superior to everyone on that list. But it is something, and in the context of medieval Europe as a whole, where religious difference was regularly treated as an existential threat requiring violent suppression. It is actually quite a lot. Let me take you to Toledo in the year 1148. Toledo had been under Muslim rule for over 3 centuries before Alonso VI of Castile captured it in 1085. When Alonso took the city, he made a decision that shocked many of his contemporaries and would have consequences that rippled forward for generations. He kept it intact. He did not expel the Muslim population. He did not seize the mosques and convert them forcibly. He issued a charter guaranteeing the rights of the Muslim community, the Madars, to continue practicing their faith, maintaining their religious institutions, and living according to their own laws. In their own quarter of the city, the reasons were partly pragmatic. You cannot run a city if you drive out everyone who knows how it works, and partly something more complicated. Alonso had spent time in exile at the Muslim court of Toledo before his own reconquest of it. He had Muslim allies. He had, by all accounts, a more nuanced view of the people he was now governing than the crusading ideology of his era would have suggested was appropriate. The result was a city that for the next 2 centuries hosted one of the most extraordinary religious landscapes in the medieval world. Toledo had Christian churches. It had mosques. It had synagogues. It had neighborhoods where the call to prayer could be heard from the minuet of a mosque, while church bells were ringing 3 streets away. It had scholars who moved between all 3 traditions with a fluency that would have been unthinkable in Paris or Rome or Baghdad, and in the quiet spaces between the official religious institutions and the private homes, in the small chapels and the personal devotional lives of ordinary people, something stranger and more intimate was happening. Here is a story that I find genuinely extraordinary and that I do not think gets nearly enough attention. In the archives of the Cathedral of Toledo, there are a series of documents from the 12th and 13th centuries recording disputes about shared sacred spaces. Shared sacred spaces. The disputes arose because several of Toledo's mosques in the decades after the Christian reconquest had been converted into churches, standard enough practice for the era. But the conversions were often incomplete. The physical structure was repurposed, but the original community did not simply disappear. And what happened in some cases was that the same building ended up serving both communities on different days for different purposes. There are records of Muslim residents continuing to use spaces within buildings that had officially become churches. There are records of Christian clergy complaining about this, and then records of local officials essentially declining to do anything about it, because the practical cost of enforcing strict separation was higher than anyone wanted to pay. And there are records, and these are the ones that stay with me, of individual Christians petitioning to be allowed to continue visiting a specific shrine or a specific space that had originally been Muslim because they had developed a devotion to it over years of living nearby, and the official reclassification of the building had not changed what the space meant to them personally. Faith is stubborn that way. It attaches itself to places, to objects, to practices, and it does not always ask permission before doing so. The phenomenon of cross-religious veneration of people from one faith genuinely venerating figures or sites from another was far more widespread in the Borderlands than the official record suggests, precisely because the official record was generally very motivated to pretend it was not happening. But occasionally the evidence slips through. In the Kingdom of Sicily under the Norman rulers of the 12th century, there are documented cases of Christian pilgrims visiting shrines that also attracted Muslim visitors, with both groups apparently understanding the sacred significance of the site in entirely different theological terms, but agreeing on the practical point that this particular place was worth the journey. In the Crusader Principality of Antioch, there are records of local Arab Christian communities maintaining devotional practices that their core religionists from Western Europe found deeply puzzling practices that had absorbed elements of the Islamic religious culture they had been living inside for generations. And in the contested borderlands of medieval Ireland, where Gaelic Celtic Christianity rubbed up against the more Roman forms brought by Anglo-Norman settlers, there was a whole category of sacred sites, holy wells, ancient stones, natural features in the landscape that both communities venerated, each according to their own theological understanding of why the place was holy. The holy well predated Christianity in Ireland entirely. It had been sacred before, and it remained sacred after, and the theological explanation for its sacredness shifted with whoever happened to be standing at it that week. Now I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of history that can tip into sentimentality if you're not watching. The cross-religious borrowing in the Borderlands was not always mutual. It was not always respectful, and it was very often accompanied by forms of coercion and hierarchy that we should not paper over. When a Mudja craftsman built a Christian church in 14th century Aragon, he was not doing so as a free act of cultural celebration. He was doing so because that was the work available, because his community was navigating a set of constraints that grew more severe with each passing generation, because survival required a kind of constant, exhausting performance of accommodation. And when a forced convert from Judaism or Islam continued to practice their original faith in secret, which happened constantly, and which the Inquisition spent enormous institutional energy trying to detect and suppress, the borderland religion they were practicing was not a charming expression of spiritual eclecticism. It was an act of preservation under pressure, a way of keeping alive something that the authorities were actively trying to destroy. The religion of the Borderlands was always on some level the religion of the vulnerable, of people who had to be careful about which God they thanked out loud, and which one they spoke to in the privacy of their own hearts. That distinction between the public faith and the private one is one of the defining features of borderland religious life, and it produced some of the most complex, layered, contradictory spiritual lives in all of medieval history. Let me tell you about a woman named Brianda de Lara. She was a converso, a converted Jew, or rather the descendant of converted Jews living in Zaragoza in the early 16th century. Her family had officially been Christian for 2 generations. They attended Mass. They observed Christian feast days. They had Christian names, Christian marriages, Christian burials. And in their home, quietly, carefully, they also lit candles on Friday evenings. They did not call it what it was even to themselves. Sometimes they called it a family tradition, a habit, something their grandmother had done, and they continued because it felt wrong to stop. The Inquisition, when it eventually reached Brianda's family, was not interested in the theological nuance of what those candles meant. It saw practice. It saw continuity. It saw evidence of what it called Judaizing, the continued secret practice of Jewish observance by people who were officially Christian. But what I see when I read about Brianda, and people like her, is something different. I see a woman trying to hold two worlds together in the only space she had full control over. The private space of her own home, the private space of Friday evening light. That image of the candles, the quiet flame kept lit in secret, generation after generation in the face of everything the outside world demanded, is to me the deepest symbol of what religion was in the Borderlands. It was not the grand theological disputes. It was not the crusades or the conquests or the conversions by force or decree. Those were the official religion, the public religion. The religion that gets recorded in chronicles and debated by scholars. The religion of the Borderlands was something smaller and more durable. It was the saint you prayed to who had a different name in your neighbor's faith, but seemed somehow to be the same presence. It was the pilgrimage you made to a mountain that had been holy to someone else before it was holy to you. It was the prayer you said in a language you were no longer supposed to speak, in an alphabet you were no longer supposed to use, written in a manuscript, hidden under the floorboards of a house in a small town in Aragon, waiting for someone to remember. And here's the question I want to leave you with just for a moment before we move on. If the official categories were so important, if being Christian or Muslim or Jewish was truly the most fundamental thing about a person in the medieval world, then why did people keep crossing those lines? Not always, not everywhere, but persistently, quietly, stubbornly. Why did a Christian woman in 12th century Toledo light a candle at a shrine that had originally been Muslim? Why did a Muslim craftsman in Norman, Sicily carve the face of the Virgin Mary with the same care and reverence he would have brought to Quranic calligraphy? Why did a Jewish physician in the Spanish borderlands spend 40 years saving the lives of both Muslim and Christian patients with equal dedication, earning the trust of communities that officially considered each other enemies? I think the answer is simpler and more profound than any theological argument. Because at the bottom of every human life, beneath all the labels and the categories and the official allegiances, there is a need that does not care what you call it. The need to believe that the universe is not indifferent to you. The need to feel that the darkness is not the final word. The Borderlands did not erase that need. They just revealed what it looked like when the official containers for it broke open, and people had to find new ways to hold it. And yet, as tender and as searching as religious life in the Borderlands could be, it existed side by side with something that we have been circling around this entire time. Something raw and immediate and impossible to ignore. Because the Borderlands were not only places of trade and language and quiet candles lit in private, they were also places where people regularly looked each other in the eye across very short distances and made decisions about whether to trust or to strike. And the system they developed for navigating that decision, the Code of Borderland Violence, is one of the most fascinating and least understood chapters in all of medieval social history. That is where we go next. All right, I need to tell you something before we go any further. Everything we have talked about up to this point, the hybrid languages, the shared shrines, the markets where enemies traded in the morning, all of it is true. All of it happened. And I meant every word I said about how remarkable it was. But I have been perhaps telling you the more comfortable parts of the story first, because the Borderlands were not a medieval version of a multicultural festival. They were not a romantic experiment in peaceful coexistence that history somehow forgot to celebrate. Alongside everything beautiful and creative and quietly extraordinary that those zones produced, there was something else running constantly in the background, something that modern people find much harder to sit with. The Borderlands ran on violence, not as an exception, not as a breakdown of the normal order, as the normal order itself. And here is the thing that took me the longest to truly understand when I was researching this, the thing that I think is the most genuinely counterintuitive fact about the entire Borderland world, that violence had rules. Elaborate, carefully maintained, socially sophisticated rules. And in many cases, those rules worked better than the laws of the kingdoms on either side. Let me take you to the Anglo-Scottish border. The year is 1397. A man named Archie Armstrong, and yes, Armstrong is a real Borderland surname with a very long and colorful history, has just had 15 of his cattle stolen in a raid conducted by men from the Scottish side of the border. He knows roughly who did it. He knows which family. He knows which valley they came from. Now, here's the question. What does Archie do? Does he go to the English king's court? Does he file a legal complaint with the sheriff? Does he write a letter to the relevant authorities and wait patiently for the wheels of medieval justice to turn? He does not, because everyone on both sides of that border knows that the king's courts are in London, and London might as well be the moon for all the practical help it offers to a man standing in a muddy field in Northland, counting the empty space where his cattle used to be. Instead, Archie Armstrong does what every man on the border knows to do. He invokes the custom. He formally declares a grievance according to the laws of the March, the Borderland legal code that had been developing through practice and precedent and negotiation for over 2 centuries. And within a specific number of days, the custom was very precise about this. A meeting will be held. A day of truce, it was called. Both sides, English and Scottish, will send their wardens. The grievances will be heard. The evidence will be examined, and a judgment will be rendered. Not by a king, not by a court in any city you have ever heard of, by the border itself, by the community of people who lived in it and understood it and had developed entirely on their own a system for managing the violence that their lives required. The March's Law, or Border Law as it was sometimes called, is one of the most fascinating legal systems in medieval history, and it is almost entirely unknown outside of specialist scholarship. It operated across the Anglo-Scottish border for roughly 3 centuries, from the late 13th century to the early 17th, when a union of the English and Scottish crowns under James I finally made it politically obsolete. For 300 years, it was the primary legal framework within which millions of border people managed their disputes, their debts, their injuries, and their complicated relationships with the people on the other side of an international boundary. And it was built entirely from the bottom up. No king designed it. No parliament passed it. No lawyers in city offices codified it into a tidy statute. It grew organically, messily, brilliantly out of the practical necessity of people who needed a way to resolve disputes that the official legal systems of 2 separate kingdoms were completely unable to handle. The March wardens, one English, one Scottish, appointed by their respective crowns, presided over the days of truce. But their power came not primarily from their royal appointments, but from their standing within the border community itself. A warden who was not trusted by both sides was useless, and the border community was remarkably good at making the life of an untrustworthy warden very difficult indeed. Here is a detail about the days of truce that I love because it perfectly captures the blend of formality and dark practicality that defined Borderland law. The truce for each meeting lasted exactly 1 day, from sunrise to sunrise of the following morning. During those 24 hours, anyone who had traveled to attend the meeting was guaranteed safe conduct. You could stand next to a man who had raided your farm 3 weeks earlier, and as long as the sun was up and the truce was in effect, neither of you could touch the other. And the enforcement mechanism for this was entirely social. There were no soldiers maintaining order at the days of truce. There was no police force. The guarantee of safety rested entirely on the shared understanding that a man who violated the truce would lose something more valuable than whatever he might gain by his violation. He would lose his standing in the border community. His family would be marked. His credibility as a participant in future meetings would be destroyed. In a world built on reputation and personal honor, and the border world was intensely built on both, that was a punishment severe enough to deter most violations. Most, not all. There were violations. There were ambushes after the truce technically expired. There were killings on the way home from meetings. The border was never completely tidy, but the system held remarkably well for generation after generation because everyone involved understood that the alternative to it was not peace. The alternative was chaos, and chaos was bad for everyone, including the raiders. Which brings me to the raiding itself, because I think the popular image of medieval border raiding is quite wrong, and getting it right matters for understanding how the whole system actually functioned. When most people imagine border raids, the word reiving was used in the Anglo-Scottish context, and a border raider was called a reiver. They imagined something like pure banditry, lawless violence for the sake of it, the strong preying on the weak with no governing logic beyond appetite. But that is not what it was. Border reiving was to a remarkable degree a structured economic activity. The primary targets were cattle, not people, not buildings. Cattle because cattle was the primary form of wealth on the border, and because cattle could be moved, sold, and integrated into your own herd without leaving evidence that was too hard to explain, There were understood limits on what you raided and how. You did not, as a general rule, burn a man's house to the ground, because a man with no house and no cattle was a man with nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose was genuinely dangerous in a way that a man who had merely lost some cattle was not. You left him enough to survive, partly out of something resembling mercy, mostly out of something resembling self-interest. There is also an understood principle of reciprocity. If your family raided mine this season, my family would raid yours next season. This was not considered a breakdown of social order. It was the social order. The cycle of raid and counter-raid maintained a rough equilibrium, a continuous redistribution of cattle wealth around the border region that over time kept any single family from accumulating so much that they became too powerful for the community to manage. One historian described it as the border's own form of economic regulation. That might sound like a stretch, but when you look at the evidence carefully, it is not entirely wrong. Let me tell you about the Armstrongs, specifically the Armstrongs of Liddesdale, which was a valley on the Scottish side of the border, and was for about a century the single most feared reaving family in the entire region. At the height of their power in the early 16th century, the Armstrongs of Liddesdale could put somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 armed riders in the field. 3,000 to 4,000. That is not a family. That is an army. And it was an army that neither the English crown nor the Scottish crown could easily control, because the Armstrongs operated according to the logic of the border, not the logic of Edinburgh or London. The Scottish King James V, a man who was not known for excessive patience, made a famous attempt to deal with the Armstrong problem in 1530. He invited the Armstrong chief, Johnny Armstrong, to a meeting under what Johnny understood to be a guarantee of safe conduct. It was not. James had Johnny Armstrong and his companions arrested and hanged on the spot. The border community was furious, not because they loved the Armstrongs unconditionally. The Armstrongs had raided everyone at one point or another, but because James had violated the principle of safe conduct, the one rule that the entire borderland legal system depended on, the one rule that made the days of truce possible, the one rule that allowed enemies to sit in the same room and talk instead of immediately trying to kill each other. A king had used his power to break the border's most fundamental social contract, and the border did not forget it. There is a ballad that was composed shortly after Johnny Armstrong's death, and ballads with the border's way of writing its own history, its own moral record of events that includes a line attributed to Johnny in his final moments. He says essentially to seek water from the well and find it poisoned. That is the worst betrayal of all. Whether Johnny Armstrong actually said those words, I cannot tell you. But the border community remembered them as true, and that remembering tells you something important about what they valued. Now I want to ask you something directly because I have been thinking about this for a while. Does any of this sound familiar? Not the cattle raiding specifically, but the broader structure, the idea of a community that operates according to its own internal code because the official legal structures around it have failed to provide anything useful. The idea of violence as a form of economic negotiation rather than pure destruction. The idea of reputation and honor as the primary enforcement mechanism in the absence of reliable external authority. Because if you look at the sociological literature on how communities organize themselves when state authority is weak or absent, whether you're looking at medieval borderlands or frontier societies in early America or certain urban communities today, you find versions of this pattern again and again. People are remarkably good at building systems of order out of the materials available to them, even when those materials include violence. Especially perhaps when those materials include violence, because the cost of disorder in such environments is so immediately and viscerally present that the incentive to develop something workable is extremely high. The border reaving system was not admirable in any simple sense. It caused real suffering. Families lost everything in raids that were perfectly legal according to border custom and devastating according to every other standard. The people on the bottom of the border hierarchy, the small farmers, the people without powerful family connections, the outsiders had very limited protection from the code that theoretically governed everyone. But it was functional, and it was in its own way sophisticated. And understanding it requires letting go of the idea that violence and social order are opposites. In the borderlands, they were partners. The Iberian frontier produced a different, but equally elaborate system for managing borderland conflict. And here I want to focus on something that rarely gets discussed: the formal institutions for handling the aftermath of violence rather than the violence itself. Because here is something that surprises people when they learn it. The medieval Spanish frontier had a thriving and carefully regulated industry in ransoms. When a person was captured in a border raid, and captures were common because a living captive was worth considerably more than a dead enemy, there were established procedures for negotiating their return. Prices were set by custom according to the social status of the captive. There were professional brokers known as alfaquaquis in Castilian, whose entire occupation was the negotiation and facilitation of ransom exchanges across the religious frontier. The word alfaq is itself Arabic from alaq, meaning the release or the liberation. A word from one language describing an institution that served both sides of a religious divide, surviving in the documents of a third tradition. The Borderlands, even in their violence, could not help producing these kinds of multilingual, multicultural survivals. The alfaquis operated under royal license. They were guaranteed safe conduct by both Christian and Muslim authorities when traveling to negotiate. They were trusted by both sides precisely because their usefulness depended on being trustworthy. A captive whose alfaquaqui had cheated the other side once would find their subsequent releases considerably more expensive and more complicated. There are records of alfaquaqis who conducted hundreds of ransom negotiations over careers spanning decades. Men who had developed such deep networks of trust on both sides of the frontier that they became, in a very real sense, more powerful than the border itself. Men who made their living from the cracks in the world. Which brings me to a final thought about borderland violence that I want to leave you with. One of the things that strikes me most reading through the evidence is how rarely the people involved in these systems describe themselves as victims of them. There are complaints. Yes, there are petitions for redress. There are genuine expressions of loss and grief when raids went too far or truces were broken. The border was not a place where suffering was unfelt. But there is also threaded through the records, and especially through the ballads and the oral traditions, that the border communities produce something else. Pride. A fierce, specific, almost defiant. Pride in being the kind of person who could navigate this world, who knew the customs, who understood the code, who could sit across from a man whose family had raided yours and negotiate with him in good faith, and hold your temper, and reach an agreement, and ride home with your reputation intact. The border people did not see themselves as trapped in a brutal and lawless existence. They saw themselves as practitioners of a demanding and sophisticated art, the art of surviving at the edge, the art of turning conflict into currency, the art of building trust in conditions specifically designed to destroy it. That art was passed down generation after generation in families with names like Armstrong and Elliott and Nixon and Graham, names that appear in the border records century after century. Families that shaped and were shaped by a landscape of extraordinary difficulty and extraordinary resilience. But here's what the official record almost never thought to ask. While all the men were out raiding and negotiating and building their fierce border reputations, while the wardens were presiding over days of truce, and the Alpha were riding across the frontier with their ransom agreements, who was running everything else? Who was managing the farms that got raided? Who was keeping the households together when the head of the family did not come home? Who was making the 1,000 quiet decisions that kept a borderland community functional during the long stretches between the dramatic moments that the chronicles actually bothered to record? The answer to that question is one of the most surprising and most overlooked chapters of the entire Borderlands story, and it is exactly where we are headed next. There is a document sitting in the National Archives in London, written in Latin on parchment, that has been folded and unfolded so many times over 8 centuries that the creases have become part of the text that records a legal dispute from the year 1281. The dispute is about land, specifically about a disputed stretch of territory on the Welsh border that 2 families both claim as their own. The case is complicated, the evidence is contradictory, and the judgment takes several pages to work through. But the thing that struck me the first time I read about this case, the thing that made me stop and read the description twice, was not the legal argument. It was the name of the person presenting one side of the case. Her name was Howie's DC, and she was not presenting the case on behalf of her husband or her father or any male guardian. She was presenting it on her own behalf as the holder of the land, as the person with legal standing in the dispute, as in every practical sense that mattered in that courtroom, the Lord of the March. Let me be honest with you about something. The history of women in the Middle Ages has been told badly for a very long time, and it has been told badly in two opposite directions, which is a neat trick if you think about it. The first bad telling is the one most of us absorbed without realizing it. The version where medieval women were essentially decorative, passive, waiting in towers for things to happen to them, defined entirely by who they were married to and how many children they produced. Present in the historical record mainly as property transferred between men. The second bad telling is the overcorrection. The version that hunts through history for individual exceptional women, the ones who dressed as knights or led armies or ran monasteries as powerful as small kingdoms, and holds them up as proof that medieval women had it better than we thought. Actually, both of these tellings miss the real story. The real story is more specific, more contextual, and more interesting than either version. Because whether a medieval woman had power, real power, not symbolic power, not borrowed power, but genuine authority over land and people and decisions, depended enormously on where she lived. And women who lived in the Borderlands had access to a kind of practical authority that women in the settled heartlands of medieval Europe very rarely possessed. Not because the Borderlands were enlightened, not because bordermen were unusually progressive in their views about gender, but because bordermen kept leaving or dying or being captured or simply being absent for months at a time on campaigns and raids and diplomatic missions. And someone had to run things while they were gone. Let us start with the Marcher ladies because I think they're the single best documented example of what I'm talking about, and their story deserves to be far better known than it is. The Welsh Marches, that long legally anomalous strip of territory between England and Wales that we met back at the beginning of this journey, operated under a system that gave the great Marcher lords almost unlimited authority within their own territories. No royal interference. No appeals to outside courts. Their word was law. And when those lords were absent, which in the 12th and 13th centuries was often because these were men with military commitments, political obligations, and a general tendency to die in places far from home, their authority passed not to a male deputy or a royal representative. It passed to their wives, not as a temporary caretaker arrangement, not as a gracious gesture from a benevolent husband, as a legal reality. The Lady of a March had in the absence of her lord the full legal authority of that lord. She could hold court. She could dispense justice. She could levy taxes. She could make military decisions. She could negotiate with neighboring lords, including on occasion lords on the other side of a border who were nominally enemies. And the historical record shows with striking consistency that they did all of these things. Isabel de Clare is perhaps the most extraordinary example. Born around 1172, Isabel was the daughter and sole heir of Richard de Clare, the Earl of Pembroke, and one of the great Marcher magnates of his era. When her father died, she inherited not just his lands, but his entire legal position, the castles, the courts, the revenues, the military. Obligations, the whole architecture of borderland power that the de Clare family had spent 2 generations building. She was 17 years old. For the next several years, while she was a ward of the English crown, which meant that King Richard I, then King John, controlled who she would eventually marry, Isabel essentially ran her own inheritance. She was not a passive figure waiting to be transferred to a husband. The records show her actively managing her estates, corresponding with her tenants, and navigating the complicated politics of a border region that never quite settled into simple categories. When she was eventually married to William Marshal, who became one of the most celebrated knights of the medieval era, the marriage was by every account a genuine partnership. William was frequently absent on campaign and royal service on diplomatic missions. Isabel managed the Marshal estates, including the great borderland territories in Wales and Ireland, with a competence that contemporary sources describe with something that sounds very much like respect. There is a letter from William Marshal to Isabel written during one of his long absences that historians of medieval marriage find remarkable. He writes to her not as a subordinate receiving instructions, but as a colleague being consulted. He asks her opinion on a specific land dispute. He defers to her judgment about a particular tenant. He trusts her evidently and explicitly in a way that contradicts the tidy narrative about medieval women having no meaningful role in public affairs. But I want to move beyond the great ladies for a moment because I think there's a risk in focusing only on the exceptional figures at the top of the social hierarchy. The interesting question is not just whether noble women in the Borderlands had more authority than we tend to assume. The interesting question is whether ordinary women, farmers' wives, craftswomen, the daughters of minor border families also experience something different in these zones than their counterparts in more settled regions. And the answer from the fragmentary evidence we have appears to be yes. Think about what borderland life actually required of an ordinary woman. Her husband might be away for weeks or months on a military campaign or a trading expedition or in the Anglo-Scottish border country on a raiding trip that could go in any number of directions. During that absence, she was not just managing a household. She was managing a farm, making decisions about livestock, about planting, about labor, negotiating with neighbors, handling debts, dealing with disputes. And in the event that the raid went wrong, in the event that her husband came home injured but did not come home at all, she was the person who had to figure out what happened next. That kind of sustained, practical responsibility shapes people. It shapes what they think they are capable of. It shapes what their communities expect of them. It shapes what the law eventually has to acknowledge about them. The legal records of the Anglo-Scottish borderlands contain a category of legal action that does not appear in most other medieval jurisdictions in quite the same form. Women suing for the return of raided goods in their own names without male representation. Not universally, not without obstacles. The legal system was not designed with them in mind, and they knew it. But the records are there. Women who had lost cattle or grain or household goods to a border raid, who appeared at the days of truce and presented their claims, and who in documented cases received judgments in their favor. One historian who spent years working through the border court records described finding case after case of what she called women acting as heads of household in all but name. Women who are managing property, resolving disputes, and engaging with the legal system in ways that the theory of medieval law said they should not be able to do, but that the practical reality of borderland life required. The border made its own rules, and women, like everyone else in the borderlands, found ways to work within them. There is one more story I want to tell you because it is specific and vivid, and it has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Her name was Black Agnes, Agnes Randolph, Countess of Dunner and March, born around 1312, died around 1369, and she earned her nickname Black Agnes for her dark complexion and darker reputation. In one of the most remarkable episodes of the entire Anglo-Scottish border conflict, in January of 1337, an English army under William Monteague, the Earl of Sperry, arrived at Dunner Castle on the Scottish coast and began a siege. Agnes's husband, the Earl of Dunbar, was away. Agnes was left in command of the castle with a small garrison against one of the most experienced English commanders of his generation. Facing siege equipment that included the most advanced military technology of the era, the siege lasted 5 months and 19 days. Agnes did not surrender. But here's the part that I find genuinely extraordinary. Not just the fact of her resistance, but the way she conducted it. Contemporary accounts describe Agnes appearing on the castle walls after each English bombardment, dressed in fine clothes attended by her ladies-in-waiting, ostentatiously wiping down the stones with a white handkerchief. As if the English catapults were not a military assault, but merely a housekeeping inconvenience. This was theater. Deliberate, calculated, brilliant theater. She was not just defending a castle. She was performing contempt, demonstrating to her own garrison and to the English army below that she was not afraid, that this was her home and she was the mistress of it. And no amount of English engineering was going to change that fundamental fact. The English eventually gave up and went home. William Monteague, it is reported, left with a poem ringing in his ears that his soldiers had composed during the siege. The poem described Black Agnes and her defenders, and was apparently not entirely complimentary about his chances of success. His Scottish countess held a castle against an English earl for 5 months through a combination of genuine military competence and extraordinary psychological warfare, and history, for several centuries, basically forgot about her. Let me ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. Why do you think that is? Why does someone like William Marshall, who is undeniably impressive, appear in almost every survey of medieval history, while his wife Isabel, who managed the same territories with the same competence for significantly longer, appears in almost none of them? Why does the Siege of Dunbar appear as a footnote in most accounts of the Anglo-Scottish Wars? While sieges conducted by male commanders with comparable outcomes get chapters to themselves, I do not think the answer is simply that people in the past did not notice women. The contemporary sources noticed Agnes. They wrote about her with evident admiration. They composed songs about her. She was famous in her own time. The answer, I think, is that the frameworks we use to organize historical memory were built by people with particular ideas about what mattered and who counted, and those frameworks had systematic blind spots. The Borderlands did not have those blind spots to the same degree because the Borderlands could not afford them. You use the people you have. You give authority to the person who can exercise it. You do not have the luxury of ideological purity when the castle needs defending and your husband is in Edinburgh. There's a pattern that I find running through the history of women in the Borderlands across different regions and different centuries that I think is worth naming clearly. Borderland women tended to have more practical authority than their legal status suggested. They tended to be more visible in the economic record, more likely to appear in documents as landholders, creditors, traders, employers. They tended to appear more often in legal records as independent actors rather than as dependent appendages to male relatives. And they tended, when the crisis came, when the raid happened, when the siege began, when the husband did not return to respond with the kind of competence that suggests they had been quietly preparing for exactly this possibility for a very long time. Not because the Borderlands were feminist utopias. They absolutely were not. The constraints on women's lives in these zones were real, and they were sometimes brutal, and I do not want to romanticize them. But within those constraints, something was happening. Something that the official culture of medieval Europe spent considerable energy trying to ignore because it complicated the story that official culture wanted to tell about who had power and who did not. The women of the Borderlands had looked at the world they were given incomplete, unstable, dangerous, demanding, and they had found within it a way to matter. That is not a small thing. And what about the children born into that world? The ones who grew up watching their mothers manage farms and hold courts and wipe castle walls with white handkerchiefs. What did that do to a child's understanding of who they were? What did it mean to grow up in a world without clear answers, without a single language, a single faith, a single unambiguous identity to anchor yourself to? What did it mean to be a child of the in-between? That question turns out to have an answer that is more surprising, more tender, and more relevant to our own moment than almost anything else in this entire story. And that is exactly where we go next. Close your eyes for a moment. Well, not literally because you're still listening, but imagine this. You are 8 years old. Every morning you wake up in a stone house on the edge of a valley that sits technically on the border between two kingdoms. Your mother calls you to breakfast in one language. Your father, when he is home, answers her in a slightly different one. The priest who comes to your village once a month speaks Latin for the formal parts of the service, and then switches to a third language for the parts he actually wants people to understand. And the boy who lives 2 farms over whose family you have known your whole life, whose cattle graze in the same hills as yours, his family prays differently than yours does, and everyone knows it. And mostly nobody says anything about it, because there are more important things to worry about. By the time you are 8 years old, you have never had a single morning where the world presented itself to you as a simple, legible, uncomplicated place. You have never had the luxury of assuming that the way your family does things is the only way things can be done. You have grown up understanding in your bones before you had the vocabulary to say it, that the world contains more than one version of itself. That was childhood in the Borderlands. And what it produced in the people who lived it is one of the most fascinating and most underexamined questions in all of medieval social history. Let me start with something that might seem small, but is actually quite profound. Medieval Borderland children were, as a general rule, multilingual before they could read. Not because their parents sat them down with language lessons, not because anyone made a deliberate educational decision about it, but simply because the environment required it. A child growing up in 12th century Toledo would hear Arabic spoken in the market Latin in the church, and the evolving Romance vernacular of Castile at home, possibly all before lunch on a given Tuesday. A child growing up in the Welsh marches in the same era might hear Norman French from the castle, Welsh from the fields, and English from the merchants passing through. Language acquisition in early childhood is, as modern neuroscience has confirmed, remarkably effortless. The young brain is built to absorb linguistic input the way dry earth absorbs rain. Children do not learn languages the way adults do, through conscious effort and deliberate study. They simply soak them up from the air around them. Borderland children soaked up 2 or 3 languages the way children in monolingual environments soak up 1. And here's what is interesting about that beyond the obvious practical utility. Being multilingual from childhood does something specific to how you think. Researchers who study bilingual children consistently find that they develop certain cognitive advantages. A stronger capacity for what psychologists call executive function, a greater ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, a more flexible relationship with categories and rules that their monolingual peers treat as fixed. In other words, the mental habit of moving between languages appears to develop the mental habit of moving between frameworks. The Borderland children were not just linguistically flexible, they were cognitively flexible. And in a world where rigid categorical thinking could get you killed, where the ability to read a situation quickly, to understand what your interlocutor needed, and how to give it to them was literally a survival skill, that flexibility was worth more than almost any other inheritance a parent could pass down. But I want to be careful because I think it is tempting to make this sound too smooth, too frictionless. Growing up between worlds was also genuinely hard. Let me tell you about a phenomenon that historians of medieval childhood have identified in the Borderlands, and that I find both fascinating and quietly heartbreaking. They call it the problem of the naming. In the medieval world, names were not just labels. They were declarations. A name placed you within a community, within a tradition, within a lineage. It announced who you were before you opened your mouth. In a Borderland community, naming a child was therefore a genuinely fraught decision. If you gave your child an Arabic name in a community that was shifting toward Christian dominance, you were marking that child as something, flagging a loyalty, a heritage, a difference that the world might not always welcome. But if you gave your child a Christian name while living in a Muslim neighborhood, or a Norman name while your Welsh neighbors watched, you were making a different kind of statement, one that your own family might experience as a kind of small betrayal. The records of Borderland naming patterns are extraordinary in their complexity. In the Crusader principalities of the 12th century, there are families where the children have a mixture of French and Arabic names within the same generation, not from carelessness, but from calculation. The firstborn son gets the name that signals heritage and social position within the ruling Christian culture. The second son gets a name that signals practical compatibility with the local Arabic-speaking world in which the family actually conducted their daily business. 2 brothers, 2 names from 2 different worlds growing up in the same house. What do they talk about? I wonder on the evenings when the adults had gone to bed and it was just the 2 of them. There is a specific category of Borderland children whose experience I want to focus on for a few minutes, because I think their story illuminates something important that goes beyond the medieval context entirely. The children of mixed marriages. Mixed marriages between Christians and Muslims, between Christians and Jews, between members of different ethnic communities were officially discouraged, periodically forbidden, and persistently common throughout the Borderlands. People fell in love. People made practical alliances. People found that the person who happened to be available and suitable and willing was not always from the approved category. This is not a modern discovery. It is a permanent feature of human social life, and the medieval Borderlands were no exception. The children of these unions occupied a position in medieval society that had no clean name, no established legal category, no recognized social role. They were not fully Christian enough for one community, not fully Muslim enough for another, not fully anything enough for any of the official structures that medieval society used to organize its members. And yet they existed in significant numbers, and they had to find ways to navigate a world that had not built a place for them. The historical record about these children is inevitably fragmentary. They are not the people who wrote chronicles or kept official records. They are glimpsed in the edges of documents and baptismal records where the father's name is French and the mother's name is Arabic, in court records where the issue of a person's religious status becomes a legal complication in wills and inheritance disputes, where the question of which community's laws apply to this particular person turns out not to have a clear answer. But occasionally they step into clearer focus. One of the most vivid examples comes from the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the mid-12th century. There was a class of people in the Crusader states called Pulin, a French word that meant approximately cults or young ones, and which was used with varying degrees of affection and contempt depending on who was using it to describe the locally born Christian population. The children and grandchildren of the original Crusaders, people who had been born in the Levant, who had grown up speaking Arabic alongside French, who had absorbed the local culture in ways that their grandparents from Normandy or Burgundy would have found deeply alien. The newly arrived Crusaders from Europe looked at the Pulin with a mixture of admiration and alarm. The admiration was for their competence. The Pan knew the land. They knew the languages. They knew which local rulers could be negotiated with, and which ones would take any sign of weakness as an invitation. They were in practical terms far better equipped to actually operate in the Levant than the fresh arrivals from Europe. The alarm was for everything else. The Pulin ate local food. They were local clothing styles. They had local friends. They trusted local people in ways that made the newly arrived, ideologically pure Crusaders deeply uncomfortable. A 12th century churchman named John of Würzburg, visiting Jerusalem around 1160, wrote with visible distaste about how the local Christian population had gone native, how they seemed to his European eyes more like the people they were supposed to be converting and governing than like proper Latin Christians. John of Würzburg went home to Europe after his pilgrimage. The Pulin stayed. And here's the thing about that. The Pulin, for all the European disdain directed at them, were the people who actually kept the Crusader states functioning for nearly 200 years. Their cultural flexibility, their linguistic range, their ability to inhabit the in-between was not a weakness. It was the entire reason the project survived as long as it did. Let me ask you something personal for a moment. Have you ever been in a situation where you belong to two different groups, two different cultures or communities or ways of thinking, and felt the pull of both where you were not quite fully at home in either one, but you understood both in ways that people who only belonged to one of them simply did not? I ask because I think this experience is far more universal than we sometimes acknowledge, far more common, and far more ancient than the modern language of identity politics would suggest. What the Borderland experienced in the 12th and 13th centuries is in its essential structure not so different from what millions of people experience today. Children of immigrants who are fully bilingual and fully bicultural and fully trusted by neither community. Children of mixed race families navigating between worlds that insist on separation. Children who grew up in communities at the edge of things economically, geographically, culturally, who learned early that the categories the powerful world uses to sort people do not quite apply to them. The medieval Borderland children figured out something that every such child in every era has had to figure out individually and often painfully. That belonging to two worlds is not the same as belonging to none. That the ability to move between frameworks is not a deficiency. That the view from the edge, uncomfortable as it is, shows you things that the view from the center cannot. There is a particular story from the Baltic frontier that I have been saving for this point, because I think it captures the complexity of Borderland childhood with unusual clarity. In the chronicles of the Teutonic Knights, who conducted their military campaigns in the Baltic from the mid-13th century onward, there are references to a practice that the Knights used as part of their pacification strategy in newly conquered territories. They took children, specifically they took children from prominent local families, pagan Prussian or Lithuanian families whose cooperation they needed, but whose loyalty they did not trust. They brought these children into the order's castles and monasteries and educated them, taught them Latin, taught them Christian theology, taught them the customs and expectations of the German culture the Knights represented. And then after some years, they sent them back. The theory was simple and coldly practical. An educated, Christianized, Latinized young man returning to his community was an agent of transformation, a bridge, someone who could interpret the new order to the old one and vice versa. What the theory did not fully account for was the human reality of what those years of education had done to those children. They had not simply been filled with new content like a jar being emptied and refilled with different liquid. They had been shaped, formed. They had developed relationships, attachments, ways of thinking that belonged to the world of the castle and the monastery. And they had done all of this while carrying somewhere underneath it the memories and the loyalties and the sense of self that they had brought with them from their original families. When they returned home, They were not what the Teutonic Knights thought they had made. They were not what their original families remembered either. They were something the theory had not predicted. They were themselves changed, complicated, carrying contradictions that they would spend the rest of their lives navigating, but themselves. The histories of individual Borderland children are with very few exceptions lost to us. The chronicles recorded the deeds of lords and bishops and military commanders. They did not follow the inner lives of children growing up between worlds. But occasionally those children grew up and left records of their own. And when they do, what you find is remarkable. What you find again and again is people with an unusual capacity for seeing more than one side of a question. People who were suspicious of simple answers, not because they were cynical, but because their entire childhood had been a demonstration that simple answers rarely survive contact with reality. People who could hold contradictions in their minds without the desperate need to resolve them that characterizes people who have only ever inhabited a single consistent worldview. There is a medieval Welsh writer, Gerald of Wales, who lived from approximately 1146 to approximately 1223, whose work exhibits exactly this quality. Gerald was himself a borderland child in the most literal sense. His father was a Norman lord. His mother was Welsh. He grew up at the intersection of two cultures, two languages, two ways of understanding the world. He was educated in the Latin tradition and became a prominent churchman. But his writings are saturated with the particular double vision of the borderland consciousness, a simultaneous ability to see and celebrate Welsh culture from the inside and to describe it for external audiences with the analytical distance of an outsider. His account of Wales and Ireland, written in the late 12th century, is one of the most vivid and surprising works of medieval literature. Precisely because of this quality, he does not write from a single stable perspective. He writes from the edge, and from the edge you see more. Gerald of Wales spent his entire life being not quite Welsh enough for one group, and not quite Norman enough for another. He was passed over for bishoprics he believed he deserved, at least partly because he did not fit cleanly into either the Welsh or the English ecclesiastical establishment. He died without the recognition he sought, but he left behind something more durable than recognition. He left behind a way of seeing, and that, I think, is the deepest thing that Borderland childhood produced. Not just multilingual competence or cognitive flexibility or practical survival skills. Those things were real and they mattered. But the deepest gift of growing up between worlds was this. It made it very difficult to be certain. Certain that your way was the only way. Certain that your language was the real language. Certain that your God was the only God and everyone else was simply wrong. In a world that ran on certainty, that organized its violence and its politics and its theology around the absolute conviction that the categories were real and the distinctions were meaningful and the boundaries were sacred. The Borderland children were quietly, persistently, almost involuntarily heretical, not in their beliefs necessarily, but in their instincts. Their instinct was always to look for the person on the other side of the line and wonder, what does it look like from over there? That instinct did not make their lives easy, but it made them, I would argue, among the most fully human people of their era. Speaking of what things look like from different perspectives, there is one dimension of daily Borderland life that we have not touched on yet. One that is on the surface the most ordinary and domestic and unglamorous of all the things we could talk about, but which turns out the deeper you look to carry the whole weight of everything we have been exploring. The food. I know after everything we have just talked about, after identity and faith and childhood and belonging, I'm telling you the next part is about dinner. But stay with me, because what people chose to eat and how they chose to cook it and who they sat down with to share it turns out to be one of the most intimate and revealing records of cultural fusion that the Borderlands produced. And some of what ended up on those medieval tables at the edge of two worlds is still on yours. That is exactly where we go next. Okay, I want you to do something for me right now. Think about the last meal you truly enjoyed. Not just ate, but genuinely properly enjoyed. The kind of meal where the smell alone made something loosen in your chest. Where the first bite reminded you of something you could not quite name. Where the flavors felt somehow like they belonged together in a way that seemed obvious, but probably was not obvious to anyone until someone somewhere figured it out. Now hold that feeling, because I want to tell you that the meal you were thinking of, whatever it was, is in all likelihood the distant descendant of a conversation that happened at a Borderland market in medieval Europe. A conversation between two people who did not share a language, did not share a faith, did not share a political allegiance, but who happened to be standing near each other with interesting ingredients and a mutual curiosity about what the other person was doing with them. Food is the most intimate form of cultural exchange, more intimate than trade, more intimate in some ways than language, because you do not just observe food or use food or admire food from a respectful distance. You put it inside your body. You let it become part of you. And in the borderlands of medieval Europe, that act of incorporation of taking what the other person ate and making it your own happened with a frequency and a depth that changed the culinary history of the entire Western world. Most people have no idea. Let me take you to a kitchen. Not a grand kitchen. Not the kitchen of a king or a great nobleman. A working kitchen in a medium-sized house in the city of Palmo, Sicily in the year 1153. The cook is a woman whose name we do not know. What we do know from the context of the household records that survive from this period is that she is probably of mixed heritage, part Norman, part Sicilian, with possibly some Arab ancestry somewhere in the recent family tree, which in 12th century Palmo was entirely unremarkable. She's making a dish for the evening meal. She starts with a base of onions and garlic cooked in olive oil, a technique that the Arab agricultural tradition brought to Sicily when the island was under Muslim rule in the 9th and 10th centuries. She adds spices cinnamon, cumin, coriander. These are Arabic spices from the trade networks that connected Sicily to North Africa and the Levant. She adds dried fruit raisins, probably a combination of sweet and savory that is entirely characteristic of medieval Arabic cooking and entirely foreign to the Northern European culinary tradition. And then she adds a pasta, a dried extruded pasta made from durum wheat. The word for it in the documents from Norman Sicily is itria, an Arabic word describing what food historians now believe is one of the earliest documented appearances of dried pasta in European history. She is making, in other words, something that is the ancestor of a dish you have almost certainly eaten in the last few weeks. And she is making it from the collision of three culinary traditions: Arab, Norman, and indigenous Sicilian, in a kitchen in a borderland city that was at that precise moment in history the most culinarily sophisticated place in all of Europe. Sicily under the Norman kings is, in my view, the single most important laboratory of culinary fusion in the medieval world. The island had been under Arab rule for roughly 2 centuries before the Normans took it in the mid-1th century. During those 2 centuries, Arab farmers had transformed the Sicilian landscape. They introduced irrigation systems that allowed year-round cultivation of crops that had previously been impossible in the dry Sicilian summer. They planted citrus trees, oranges, lemons, limes. They cultivated sugarcane. They brought eggplant, spinach, artichokes. They established the mulberry plantations that fed the silkworms that made Sicily one of the silk-producing centers of the Mediterranean. When the Normans arrived and took the island, they did something that was by the standards of medieval conquest genuinely unusual. They kept the farmers. They kept the irrigation systems. They kept the orchards. They kept the agricultural knowledge. They employed Arab agronomists and Arab cooks and Arab physicians and Arab astronomers in the royal court because the Arab intellectual and practical tradition was in 1172 or 1183 simply better at most things than anything the Normans had brought with them from northern France. The result was a court and a culture that combined things that by rights had no business being combined. A Norman king who spoke Arabic and commissioned Arabic poetry, sitting down to a dinner cooked in the Arab style in a palace decorated with Islamic geometric tile work, presiding over a court where Greek-speaking administrators and Latin-speaking clergy and Arabic-speaking scholars all coexisted in a state of creative, productive, occasionally fractious proximity. And out of that kitchen, out of that specific combination of Norman wealth and Arab technique and Sicilian ingredients, came things that are still with us today. Here's a question I want to throw at you, and I genuinely want you to think about it. What does spaghetti aglio, aiolio, a Moroccan chine, a Persian rice dish with dried fruit, and a Christmas mince pie have in common? I will tell you they are all in their different ways descendants of the culinary borderlands. The combination of meat with dried fruit and spices, sweet and savory together, that seems so exotic to modern Northern European and American palates, is actually a direct inheritance from the medieval Arab culinary tradition as it passed through the borderland kitchens of Sicily and Spain. The mince pie, which started as an actual meat pie with dried fruit and spices, was originally called a shr pie from an Arabic word meaning something chopped or minced. It came to England through the Crusader trade routes via the Norman Sicilian kitchen, and it sat on English Christmas tables for centuries before anyone thought to take the meat out and leave just the sweetened fruit filling. Every time you eat a mince pie at Christmas, you're eating a ghost of the medieval borderlands. I find that genuinely delightful. But Sicily is not the only story here, and I do not want to leave you thinking that the culinary borderland were just a Sicilian phenomenon. The Iberian Peninsula produced its own extraordinary culinary fusion, and the evidence for it is sitting in one of the most remarkable documents in medieval food history. It is a cookbook written in Arabic in 13th century Andalusia in the territory that was at the time of its composition already shifting back and forth between Christian and Muslim control. The cookbook is known in the scholarly literature as the Andalusian Cookbook, sometimes referred to by its Arabic title, which translates roughly as a reliable source on the good dishes of Andalusia, and it is a window into a culinary world of almost bewildering sophistication and complexity. The recipes in this collection draw from Arab, Persian, Berber, and Iberian culinary traditions simultaneously. There are lamb dishes scented with lavender and rosewater. There are dishes that combine vinegar and honey in proportions that should not work, but apparently do. There are recipes that specify the precise moment in the cooking process when certain spices should be added, advice that modern professional chefs would recognize as entirely sound, and recipes that include ingredients from 4 different continents. But what is most remarkable about the cookbook is not any single recipe. It is the fact that it exists at all, because writing down recipes was not something that every culinary culture did. The Arabic culinary tradition placed enormous value on written codification of knowledge, and that tradition of writing things down, of treating cooking as a form of intellectual activity worthy of documentation and analysis, passed into the kitchens of the Christian kingdoms as the Reconquista moved south, carried by the Mudja cooks who remained in the conquered cities and continued cooking for their new Christian employers. The culinary knowledge of medieval Al-Andalus did not disappear with the political change. It walked into the new kitchen and kept working. There is something I want to say about spices specifically, because I think the role of spices in the Borderlands story is one of the most misunderstood things in medieval food history. The popular image of medieval spice use is that European nobles dumped enormous quantities of cinnamon and pepper on everything to disguise the taste of rotting meat. This is almost entirely wrong, and it is worth taking a moment to explain why. Because getting it right reveals something important about what the Borderlands actually contributed. Medieval spices were expensive, extraordinarily expensive. Black pepper in the 12th and 13th centuries was worth more per weight than silver in many European markets. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg. These were luxury goods that traveled from the spice islands of the Far East through the Arab trading networks across the Indian Ocean, through the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea, through the Levant across the Mediterranean, and finally into the markets of Europe. You did not use these things to disguise spoiled meat. You used them to demonstrate that you could afford them. But here is the borderland dimension of the story. The communities that lived at the edge of the Arab world in Sicily and southern Spain, and the Crusader principalities of the Levant, had access to spices that arrived earlier and cheaper than they did further north. They had Arab neighbors and Arab merchants who understood spice use not as a display of wealth, but as a genuine culinary art form. An art form with a long, sophisticated, carefully developed tradition of understanding how specific spices interacted with specific ingredients at specific stages of cooking, and they absorbed that tradition. The cookbooks that begin to appear in the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain from the 13th and 14th centuries show a culinary culture that has inherited the Arab tradition of complex spice use, not as luxury display, but as genuine flavor technique. Combinations of spices that are used with precision and intention. Timing that shows real understanding of how heat affects aromatic compounds. This knowledge traveled northward through the trading networks and the kitchen connections of the Borderlands, and it eventually transformed European cooking in ways that are still visible today. Let me tell you about a dish that I think is one of the most perfect symbols of culinary borderland fusion in the entire medieval record. It is called escape in Spanish, scapete in Italian, and versions of it appear under different names across the entire Mediterranean world from the 13th century onward. The dish is simple in principle. Cooked fish or meat preserved in a marinade of vinegar, oil, and spices, usually including saffron, cumin, and various aromatics. The acidic marinade both flavors and preserves the food, extending its shelf life significantly in an era without refrigeration. The word itself is Arabic in origin from sikbaj, a Persian origin dish that the Arab culinary tradition had refined and spread across the Islamic world before it arrived in the borderland kitchens of Sicily and Spain. From there, it traveled north. Versions of escobeche appear in medieval French cookbooks from the 14th century. Versions appear in English manuscripts from the same period. It traveled along the same trade routes as the merchants, the silks, the spices. It became part of the broader European culinary vocabulary. And then centuries later, when the Spanish and Portuguese reached the Americas, they brought it with them. In Peru and Mexico and the Philippines, escoite became part of local culinary traditions, mixing again with new ingredients and new techniques to produce new versions that are now claimed as distinctively local. A dish that started in the medieval borderlands of Spain, which had inherited it from Arab cooks who had refined it from a Persian original. That dish is now served in restaurants in Lima and Manila, and most of the people eating it have no idea of its 800-year journey. The borderlands, in a sense, are still spreading. I want to slow down for a moment and sit with something that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. The culinary exchange in the borderlands happened mostly in the private space of the kitchen. It was not declared. It was not debated. Nobody issued a royal proclamation saying that the Christian and Muslim and Jewish culinary traditions of the medieval Mediterranean were henceforth to be combined into something new. It just happened. In the daily unglamorous, intensely practical work of feeding people, a cook needed to feed a household. She had certain ingredients available. She had learned certain techniques from her mother, who had learned them from her mother, who had learned them from her neighbor, who had learned them from someone who had grown up on the other side of the frontier. She did not think of herself as participating in a historic act of cultural synthesis. She was making dinner, and yet the dinner she made carried within it the accumulated knowledge of centuries of borderland exchange. The spice combinations, the cooking techniques, the ingredient pairings, all of it was a kind of compressed history, a record of every encounter, every influence, every moment of curiosity or necessity or simple hunger that had brought two culinary traditions close enough to touch. There's a philosopher of food named Massimo Molinari, an Italian medievalist who wrote something that I've thought about many times since I first encountered it. He argued that food is not just nourishment. It is, in his words, a cultural product, a way that human communities express, preserve, and transmit their identity. But in the borderlands, food was something even more specific than that. It was a record of encounter. Every dish that emerged from those medieval frontier kitchens was a document written not in ink, but in flavor, saying, these two worlds met here. They did not agree on everything. They did not like each other necessarily or trust each other or wish each other well, but they ate together, and the eating changed them both. The spice trade that made all of this possible, that brought the flavors of the Arab world into the borderland kitchens of Sicily and Spain and the Crusader states, was also in a deep irony of history, one of the forces that eventually brought the borderlands themselves to an end. Because when the Ottoman Empire consolidated control over the eastern Mediterranean trade routes in the mid-15th century, the cost and difficulty of spice importation through the traditional channels increased dramatically, and that the pressure of disrupted commerce, of rising prices of the felt, need to find new routes to the sources of supply, pushed the European maritime powers westward. Columbus sailed in 1492, the same year incidentally that the last Muslim kingdom in Spain fell, and the same year that the Jews were expelled from Spain. 1492. It is one of those years where you realize that history does not move in separate channels. It moves in floods. And what was swept away in that flood, along with much else, was the particular culinary world of the medieval borderlands. The kitchens where Arab and Christian and Jewish cooks had worked side by side, borrowing each other's techniques, sharing each other's spices, producing the extraordinary hybrid cuisine of the medieval Mediterranean. That world ended, but the food survived. It survived in recipe manuscripts. It survived in the kitchens of communities that scattered across the Mediterranean after the expulsions. It survived, transformed, and adapted in the cuisines of every country the borderland people settled in. It is still surviving now on your plate, in your pantry, in the combination of flavors that taste somehow like it has always been exactly right, which leaves us, as all good meals eventually do, with a kind of reckoning. Because everything we have talked about in this long journey, the people, the languages, the faiths, the violence, the children, the food, all of it was part of a world that by the 15th and 16th centuries was drawing toward a close. The great borderland era of medieval Europe did not end with a single dramatic event. It ended with maps, with a slow, steady, relentless process of powerful states deciding that ambiguity was expensive, that hybrid zones were inefficient, that the people who lived between worlds were ultimately a problem to be solved rather than a resource to be valued. How that happened and what exactly was lost when it did is the story that has been waiting underneath everything else we have talked about since the very beginning of this journey, and it is where we go next. Something changed in Europe around the middle of the 15th century. Not suddenly, not with a single announcement or a single event, but gradually the way a season changes the way you do not notice summer ending until one morning you wake up and the light is different and you realize with a small shock that something has shifted without asking your permission. The change was on the surface administrative, bureaucratic even. Kings got better at record keeping. They hired more officials. They built more elaborate systems for collecting taxes, registering land, tracking the movement of goods and people across their territories. They developed what historians call the apparatus of the early modern state, the machinery of centralized governance that we now take completely for granted. And that machinery, as it grew and spread and became more sophisticated, did something to the borderlands that centuries of crusade and conquest and religious conflict had never managed to do. It made them legible. And once the borderlands became legible to the state, once they could be mapped, measured, taxed, categorized, they ceased in the most fundamental sense to be borderlands at all. Let me tell you about a map. Not a metaphorical map, an actual physical object that I want you to picture in your mind. It was commissioned in the late 15th century by the Spanish crown following the unification of Castile and Aragon under Ferdinand II and Isabella I. It was part of a broader project of territorial documentation, an attempt to understand in precise graphic terms exactly what the newly unified Spanish kingdom contained and where its boundaries lay. The people who made this map were skilled. They traveled. They measured. They recorded with a precision that earlier medieval crafters had never attempted. And as they worked, they encountered something that their categories had no room for. They encountered communities that did not fit. Communities that had been living in the in-between for so long that they had become in every practical sense their own thing. Communities where the question of which kingdom they belonged to had never had a clean answer, because the question had never been particularly important to the people living there. They belonged to the valley. They belonged to the trade route. They belonged to the particular web of relationships and obligations and customs that their grandparents and great-grandparents had built. The map could not accommodate that answer. The map required a line, and on one side of the line you were Spanish, and on the other side you were something else. And the communities that had built their entire existence on the proposition that lines were negotiable, that belonging was contextual, that identity was layered rather than singular, those communities were about to discover that the state disagreed. The year 1492 stands in history as one of those extraordinary moments of convergence where multiple enormous events happen in the same calendar year, and each one illuminates the others. In January, the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella. The last Muslim political entity in the Iberian Peninsula, the last remnant of the 800-year borderland world of Al-Andalus, surrendered after a 10-year military campaign. In March, the Alhambra Decree was issued. All Jews who refused conversion to Christianity were required to leave Spain within 4 months. A community that had lived in the Iberian Peninsula for over 1,000 years, that had been in many ways the connective tissue of the borderland economy, the translators and physicians and financiers who had made the whole complex system function, was given until the end of July to pack up and go. In August, a Genoese navigator sailing under the Spanish flag crossed the Atlantic and made landfall in the Caribbean. 3 events, 1 year, and together they announced with a kind of terrible clarity the end of one world and the violent beginning of another. The old borderland world. The world of negotiated identity, of permeable categories of communities that belonged to more than one thing was being replaced by something new. Something that required clarity, required allegiance, required you to be definitively and unambiguously one thing. The age of the nation-state was arriving, and it did not come gently. Let me tell you what the fall of Granada actually looked like on the ground. Because the official history tends to focus on the military and the diplomatic, and the human reality was considerably more complicated. When the last Nasrid Sultan Muhammad, the first 12th known in Spanish as Bo Abdul, handed over the keys of the Alhambra to the Catholic monarchs on the 2nd of January, 1492, the terms he had negotiated were on paper relatively generous. The Muslim population of Granada was guaranteed the right to practice their faith. They were guaranteed the right to maintain their mosques. They were guaranteed the right to live according to their own laws and customs. They were guaranteed, in other words, something very much like the old borderland arrangement, the accommodation, the negotiated coexistence, the practical tolerance that had characterized the best moments of medieval Iberian life. Those guarantees lasted approximately 7 years. By 1499, the Archbishop of Toledo, Cardinal Cisneros, had grown impatient with the slow pace of voluntary conversion and had begun a policy of forced baptism. He ordered the burning of Arabic manuscripts, an act that destroyed an unknown but certainly enormous quantity of irreplaceable knowledge. He organized mass conversions that were, by any honest reading of the evidence, not voluntary. The Muslim population of Granada, the people who had been guaranteed their rights 7 years earlier, now faced a choice that was not really a choice. Convert or leave. Most eventually converted. They became the Morisos, officially Christian, quietly preserving what they could of their original culture in the private spaces that the state had not yet learned to penetrate. And then between 609 and 1614, the Spanish crown decided that even that was not enough. The Morisco population, by then almost entirely Spanish-born, Spanish-speaking, Catholic-baptized, several generations removed from any direct connection to the original Muslim community of Granada, was expelled en masse. Somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 people expelled from the only country they had ever known because the state had decided that hybridity itself was the problem, that you could not trust someone who carried more than one world inside them. The story of what was lost in those years in 1492 and in the decades immediately before and after is one that historians have been slowly reconstructing for the past century. And it is a story that keeps turning out to be larger and more significant than anyone initially estimated. Here is one dimension of it that I find particularly striking. The Jewish community expelled from Spain in 1492 included a significant proportion of the most highly educated people in the entire Iberian Peninsula. Physicians, astronomers, mathematicians, philosophers, financial administrators with decades of experience managing the complex economies of the Castilian and Aragon's kingdoms. Fernando de Tala, who was Isabella's confessor and one of the architects of the expulsion policy, apparently argued that the disruption would be temporary, that the kingdom would adjust, that the skills and knowledge these communities carried could be replaced or replicated. He was wrong. The disruption was not temporary. The Ottoman Empire, which welcomed the expelled Sephardic Jewish community, Sultan Bayezid II, reportedly said that Ferdinand was impoverishing his own kingdom in order to enrich the Ottomans, gained a sudden influx of highly skilled administrators, physicians, and financial specialists. Several of the expelled scholars made direct contributions to Ottoman medicine and astronomy within a generation of their arrival. Spain lost them. The Ottoman Empire gained them. And the difference was visible in the economic and intellectual trajectories of both empires for the next century. But I want to zoom out from Spain for a moment, because the process I'm describing was not exclusively Spanish. It was European. This same impulse that drove the expulsions and forced conversions in Iberia, the impulse toward religious and cultural uniformity as a foundation for political unity, was operating across the continent simultaneously in different forms and with different intensities. In England, Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s was followed by decades of religious violence as the country lurched between Protestant and Catholic settlements. And the communities that have found ways to navigate the ambiguity of the old system found themselves suddenly required to declare an unambiguous allegiance. In Germany, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 established the principle that the religion of the ruler determined the religion of the territory. Cuius regio aus religio, as the Latin formula had it. The prince decides the faith of his people. Think about what that formula does to a borderland community. To a community that had spent generations developing its own negotiated relationship with religious identity. Suddenly, the question was settled not by the community's own accumulated wisdom and practice, but by the political decision of whoever happened to be the territorial lord. The ambiguity that had been the Borderlands' defining characteristic, the very quality that had made them so creative, so flexible, so unexpectedly productive, was now officially a problem. A problem to be eliminated. A problem that the rational, efficient, increasingly powerful early modern state had both the motivation and the tools to address. Here's what I find most interesting about this moment in history, and it is something that I do not see discussed very often. The people who drove the homogenization of the early modern period, the Ferdinand and Isabellas, the Cisneros types, the architects of religious unity, they were not in general stupid people. They were not even in their own terms, obviously cruel people. Many of them genuinely believed that what they were doing was good, was right, was necessary. Their argument stripped to its essentials was this: a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. A population that holds multiple loyalties, that practices multiple faiths, that identifies with multiple communities, is a population that cannot be fully trusted, cannot be fully governed, cannot be fully mobilized in defense of the common interest. Unity in this view was not an optional luxury. It was a survival requirement. And the terrifying thing is that the argument is not entirely wrong. There is genuine historical evidence that multi-ethnic, multi-religious polities face real governance challenges. That the management of internal diversity requires enormous institutional sophistication and goodwill that are not always available. That the borderland arrangement, for all its creativity and flexibility, was also genuinely fragile. The medieval borderlands did not end because the powerful simply became evil. They ended because the powerful decided on the basis of a reasonable reading of their circumstances that the cost of maintaining complexity was higher than their benefit. They were wrong about that calculation. I think deeply consequentially wrong. But they were not simply ignorant or malicious, which in some ways makes it harder to think about, not easier. There is a physical monument to the end of the Borderlands that I want to tell you about because I think it captures something important about what the transition from medieval ambiguity to early modern clarity actually looked like on the ground. In the year 1563, King Philip II of Spain began construction of a building complex in the mountains northwest of Madrid. It was called the Estoril. The Estoril was a monastery, a royal palace, a library, and a mausoleum all in one. It took 21 years to build. When it was complete, it was the largest building in the world. And it was in its architecture, its iconography, and its symbolic program a complete and deliberate repudiation of everything the borderland world had represented. Where the Alhambra in Granada, the great palace of the Nasrid sultans, was all flowing water and colored light and geometric complexity and the deliberate blurring of the boundary between interior and exterior, sacred and secular, human and divine. The Estoril was severity, granite, right angles, the absolute clarity of a single unambiguous religious and political equal authority. The Alhambra said many things can coexist in the same beautiful space. The Estoril said there is one God, one king, one truth. The distance between those two buildings, not just in miles, but in worldview, is the distance between the medieval borderland world and the early modern state. And what was lost in that transition? I have been building toward this question for this entire journey, and I want to try to answer it honestly rather than sentimentally. What was lost was not utopia. The medieval borderlands were not utopia. We have established that thoroughly. What was lost was a particular kind of institutional tolerance for ambiguity, a particular kind of collective agreement to allow people to be more than one thing, to let communities develop their own internal logic, to accept that the line between us and them was sometimes more useful as a trading post than as a wall. What was lost was the infrastructure of encounter, The markets, the translation schools, the shared shrines, the hybrid kitchens, the borderland legal systems, all of the practical arrangements that had allowed very different people to build something together that neither could have built alone. And what was lost most concretely was the people. The hundreds of thousands expelled from Spain. The Mudejar communities forced to convert or leave. The Moriscoco communities expelled 2 generations later, even after conversion. The Jewish communities scattered to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, to the Netherlands, to everywhere except the home they had known for 1,000 years. Those people carried with them into exile a set of skills and knowledges and ways of being in the world that the places they left did not recover for a very long time. Some of those places are still missing them. There's a phrase that appears in several of the lament poems written by the expelled Sephardic Jews in the months after 1492. A phrase that has stayed with me since I first encountered it in translation. They called Spain La Madriatria, the mother country. They called it that, even as they were leaving it, even as it had rejected them, even as they were sailing away with whatever they could carry toward an uncertain exile in lands they did not know. La Madre Patria, the mother country, that capacity to love a place that has hurt you, to carry it with you into exile, to keep its memory alive across generations in food and language and song and prayer, is, I think, one of the most specifically human things I know. And it is also perhaps the most enduring legacy of the borderland world. The people who were made by the in-between did not stop being people of the in-between just because the in-between was taken from them. They carried it into the world. And somewhere in that carrying, in the Ladino spoken by Sephardic communities in Istanbul and Thessaloniki and Amsterdam, in the Arabic-inflected Spanish that survived in North African exile communities, in the culinary traditions and musical traditions and ways of telling stories that outlasted the political arrangements that had produced them. The borderlands continued quietly, stubbornly against considerable odds, as borderland things tend to do. And which brings us finally to the question that I think has been underneath all of this from the very beginning. Not what the borderlands were, not even what was lost when they ended, but what they mean now. What we sitting here in the 21st century in a world that is simultaneously more connected and more fractured than any world that has come before it. What we are supposed to do with this story, because I do not think history is just the past. I think history is a mirror, and the borderlands of medieval Europe are showing us something in that mirror that is urgent and uncomfortable and more relevant to the world we are actually living in than almost anything else I have ever researched. That is the final part of our journey, and it begins right now. We have traveled a long way tonight from the edges of medieval maps, where the topographers gave up and wrote "Here be dragons" through the hybrid markets and the borrowed languages, and the shared shrines, and the raided cattle, and the hidden manuscripts and the kitchens where enemies cooked each other's food. We have met Paetus Alonzi, who held 3 worlds inside one life. We have stood with Black Agnes on the walls of Dinner Castle, watching English catapults with a white handkerchief and something very close to amusement. We have sat with the children of the in-between, the Poulin, the Mossrabs, the border boys taken into castle monasteries and returned as something their families no longer fully recognized. We have tasted the ghost of medieval kitchen in every mince pie and every pasta dish and every pinch of cinnamon we have ever added without thinking about where it came from. And now we have arrived at the question that, honestly, I have been wanting to ask you since the very first minute of this journey. Does any of this sound familiar? Not historically familiar. Not. I remember reading about this in school. Familiar? I mean familiar the way your own life is familiar. Let me tell you something that I think about often and that I have never seen written about quite directly enough. We live right now in a world that is engaged in a very old argument. The argument is about complexity, about whether human beings can manage it, whether societies can survive it, whether the existence of people who carry more than one world inside them, who are more than one thing, who belong to more than one community, who refuse to fit cleanly into the categories the powerful world uses to organize its citizens, whether those people are an asset or a threat. That argument is not new. It is in fact one of the oldest arguments in the history of civilization. And the medieval borderlands are one of the places where it played out most visibly, most dramatically, and most instructively. Here's what I mean. Pick up any newspaper or scroll any news feed, since that is probably more accurate for most of us, and you will find somewhere in it a version of the same fundamental anxiety that drove Cardinal Cisneros to burn the Arabic manuscripts in 1499. The anxiety that mixture is dangerous. That people who inhabit multiple identities cannot be trusted to be loyal to any of them. That the communities which live at the edges geographically, culturally, economically are somehow less real, less valid, less deserving of protection than the communities at the center. You will find that anxiety expressed in debates about immigration, about multiculturalism, about whether cities that contain dozens of languages and dozens of cultures are signs of vitality or signs of fragmentation. You will find it in the politics of border regions across the world, from the United States and Mexico, to Eastern Europe, to South Asia, to Sub-Sahara and Africa, where the people who actually live at the edges of things are perpetually subject to the decisions of powers far away that have never bothered to understand what those edges actually produce. And you will find it sometimes in yourself, in that small, uneasy feeling when the world presents itself as more complicated than you would like. When the clear line you were hoping to find turns out to be a zone. When the person you expected to be simply one thing turns out to be, like every interesting person, considerably more than one. But here's what the Borderlands teach us. And I want to say this carefully because I think it is the most important thing in this entire story, and I do not want to rush it. The Borderlands did not produce their extraordinary achievements despite the complexity. They produced them because of it. The translation movement that brought Aristotle back to Europe, that happened in Toledo at the intersection of 3 faiths and 2 languages. Because that was the only place where the people with the necessary combination of knowledge and access actually existed. The culinary revolution that created the foundation of modern Mediterranean and European cooking that happened in the kitchens of Sicily and Andalusia, because those were the places where the ingredients of one tradition met the techniques of another in the hands of cooks who understood both. The literary tradition that runs from the Sicilian school through Dante to the entire edifice of Italian and ultimately European literature that was born in a multilingual court where a Norman king sat down to Arabic poetry and Greek administration and Latin theology simultaneously, and found that the combination produced something that none of them contain alone in innovation again and again and again throughout history. Happens at the edges, at the places where different systems of knowledge meet and are forced to negotiate with each other, where the assumptions of one tradition are challenged by the existence of another, where people who have been shaped by more than one world bring that double vision to problems that single world thinking has been unable to solve. The border is not a weakness in the system. The border is where the system grows. I want to tell you about one more person before we close. Her name was Elena Ferrante. No, I'm joking. Elena Ferrante is a contemporary novelist, and while she is extraordinary, she is not who I want to tell you about. The person I want to tell you about does not have a name in the historical record. She's simply described in a 12th century document from the city of Toledo as a woman of mixed parentage known for her skill in medicine and her knowledge of 3 languages. That is all we have. We do not know her name. We do not know exactly who her parents were. The mixed parentage could mean Christian and Muslim Christian and Jewish Muslim and Jewish, or some combination of all 3 communities that the scribe did not think it necessary to specify precisely. We do not know what happened to her, whether she lived a long life or a short one, whether she had children who carried her knowledge forward, or whether it ended with her. What we know is that she existed, that she was known, that in a city at the center of the borderland world in the 12th century, a woman with multiple heritages and multiple languages and expertise in medicine was sufficiently notable to be mentioned in a document, even without the dignity of a name. She was there. She was real. And she represents for me the truest face of the Borderlands. Not the lords and the wardens and the kings and the theologians who get the chapters in the textbooks, but the unnamed, ordinary, extraordinary people who simply showed up every day and navigated a complicated world with whatever they had been given, with multiple languages and mixed heritage and skills borrowed from every tradition available, with the double vision of someone who had never been allowed the luxury of seeing only one thing at a time. So what do we do with all of this? What does a story about medieval Borderlands mean to you listening tonight, wherever you are in whatever version of the in-between you happen to inhabit? I think it means several things. It means that the human capacity for complexity is not a modern invention. It is ancient. It is tested. It has been demonstrated under conditions of genuine difficulty, not just the comfortable difficulty of a world with running water. and reliable food supply. The people of the medieval borderlands managed to build remarkable things in circumstances that were by any objective measure much harder than ours. They managed to translate across languages, to negotiate across faiths, to trade across political boundaries that armies were simultaneously trying to enforce at the cost of enormous human suffering. They were not always successful. They were not always good. The borderlands produced injustice and exploitation alongside everything beautiful. I have tried not to pretend otherwise, but they kept trying, generation after generation. They kept showing up at the market, kept maintaining the trust, kept making the food, kept writing the manuscripts and hiding them under floorboards when necessary, kept passing the knowledge to the next generation in whatever form was available. That persistence, that stubborn, practical, unromantic insistence on building connection across difference, is, I think, the deepest lesson the borderlands have to offer. There's a concept in ecology called an edge effect. It refers to the phenomenon that occurs at the boundary between two different ecosystems, where a forest meets a meadow, for instance, or where a river meets a plain. At these edges, biodiversity tends to be highest. The species from both adjacent ecosystems are present along with species that only exist at the edge itself. Species that require the specific conditions created by the meeting of two different environments. The edge is, ecologically speaking, the most alive place in the landscape. I do not think it is an accident that the same principle applies to human cultures. The places where different human ecosystems meet, where languages and faiths and ways of organizing the world rub up against each other and are forced to negotiate, those places produce a disproportionate share of the ideas, the art forms, the technological innovations, and the practical wisdom that the rest of civilization eventually inherits. The medieval borderlands were edge effects. So were the Renaissance city-states of Italy, which sat at the intersection of European, Byzantine, and Islamic trade networks. So was the Vienna of the early 20th century, where multiple languages and multiple cultural traditions produced within a generation an extraordinary concentration of intellectual and artistic achievement. So is every immigrant neighborhood in every city that has ever welcomed people from somewhere else and let them build something new. The pattern is consistent enough that I do not think it is coincidence. I think it is how human creativity actually works. And here is the thought I want to leave you with tonight. The thought that has been building quietly underneath everything else we have talked about. You might not think of yourself as a borderland person. You might live at the middle of somewhere, not the edge. You might have a clear, unambiguous sense of who you are and where you belong. And if so, genuinely, that is a gift. And I do not want to suggest that clarity of belonging is anything other than valuable. But most of us, I suspect, carry more than one world inside us than we usually admit. Most of us know what it is to navigate between different versions of ourselves, to speak one language at home and another at work, to hold traditions that came from different places and sometimes pull in different directions, to understand two different communities well enough to translate between them. Even if we never think of that understanding as a skill, most of us are in some sense creatures of the in-between. And the people of the medieval borderlands, the unnamed physician in Toledo, the bilingual children on the Spanish frontier, the border women who managed farms while the men were away, the pool who kept the Crusader states running while the newcomers looked at them with alarm, the cooks who made dinner from the meeting of two worlds without thinking of themselves as making history. Those people are in a very real way our people. Not because we share their circumstances. We do not. But because we share their fundamental condition, the condition of living in a world that insists on simple categories, while human experience insists just as persistently on being more complicated than any category can hold. The borderlands of medieval Europe are gone. The specific zones, the Welsh marches, the Spanish frontier, the Baltic edge, the Norman court in Sicily, where Arabic poetry and Latin theology and French chivalry somehow shared the same room. Those specific configurations no longer exist. But the borderland impulse has not gone anywhere. Every time a translator renders something from one world comprehensible to another, that is a borderland act. Every time a cook takes an ingredient from one tradition and a technique from another and makes something that tastes like neither and better than both, that is a borderland act. Every time a person who carries two worlds inside them sits down at a table with people from both worlds and refuses to choose, refuses to pretend that the complexity is less than it is, insists on being the full and contradictory and irreducible thing that they actually are. That is a Borderland act. The Borderlands are not a place. They are a practice, and they are available to anyone willing to live the edge of their own certainties. We have been traveling together for a long time tonight, through 8 centuries of European history, through a dozen cities and 100 forgotten lives, through languages that no one speaks anymore, and foods that everyone eats without knowing their names, through violence that had rules and faith that crossed its own boundaries and childhoods that produced adults the world had not planned for. And I want to say before we part, thank you. Not in a formal way, in the genuine way that you thank someone who has stayed with you through something long and complicated and worth doing, because you did not have to be here for all of this. You could have gone to sleep hours ago, but you stayed. And that says something about you that I find honestly rather wonderful. You are the kind of person who wants to understand things fully, who is willing to sit with complexity rather than reaching for the near simple answer, who finds in the lives of people who lived 800 years ago in circumstances utterly unlike your own something that feels somehow relevant. You are, in other words, exactly the kind of person the Borderlands would have valued. If there's one thing I hope you carry from tonight into whatever comes next into the complicated world that is waiting for you on the other side of sleep, it is this. The most creative, most resilient, most unexpectedly generative communities in human history have not been the ones that achieve the most perfect uniformity. They have been the ones that learned to make something out the meeting, the ones that stood at the edge of 2 worlds, looked at the strangeness across the boundary, and said, I wonder what we could build together. That is the Borderland legacy. It belongs to all of us. So get comfortable. Let the story settle in. And as you drift off tonight, maybe let yourself think about the edges in your own life, the places where your worlds meet, the things you understand from 2 directions at once. Because that double vision, that complicated, inconvenient, sometimes exhausting capacity to hold more than one truth at a time, is not a problem to be solved. It is if the medieval Borderlands taught us anything, a gift, one that humanity has been giving itself quietly and persistently for as long as we have been drawing lines on maps and then finding reasons to cross them. Sleep well, friend. This was a journey worth taking, and the next one, I promise you, is already waiting.